Order. The Chairman of Ways and Means has asked me to inform the House that she will consider for selection for the committee stage of terrorist offenders restriction of early release bill. Amendments can be tabled up to and until 1 o'clock today. We now come to questions of Secretary of State for Scotland, Alex Cunningham.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is committed to tackling poverty so that we can make a lasting difference to long-term outcomes. This Government has lifted 400,000 people out of absolute poverty since 2010, and income inequality has fallen. While the Scottish Government has powers to tackle poverty through the devolution of skills, education, health and employment programmes, it is important that Scotland's two governments work together to address this critical issue.
Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Scotland, it's estimated that 1 in 4 children, that's 230,000 of them, are living in poverty, and this is substantially higher than in many other European countries. And like poor children everywhere, these children are likely to achieve less in school, they're more likely to suffer chronic illness and poor mental health. And yet the Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts that child poverty could rise to around 37% by 2021. Does the Minister not agree that it is Tory government welfare policies, such as the two-child benefit cap, zero-hour contracts and the dreaded universal credit, that are contributing to the increasing rate of child poverty in Scotland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He won't be surprised to know that I disagree with him. Since 2010, there are over 3.8 million more people in work and 730,000 fewer children growing up in workless households. Over 3/4 of this employment growth, Mr. Speaker, has been in full-time work, which can be proven to substantially reduce the risk of poverty. But I know how passionate the honourable gentleman is on this issue. I'd be very happy to meet with him to hear his concerns.
Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's got to reflect on his answer. Yes, of course he's right about the growth of employment, but the majority of children in Scotland, 230,000 of them, are living in families with parents in work. That's a disgrace. Now, what is this government going to do about it?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't want to see one individual, family or child in poverty. And the honourable gentleman talks about in-work poverty, and we are taking action as a government to tackle in-work poverty. Real wages have risen for over a year, 22 months in a row. Total wages rose by 3.2%. The national living wage rises to £8.72 in April, and we want to go further, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the Chancellor has announced that the national living wage will rise to £10.50 by 2024, and we also have a focus through our network of job centres around in-work progression.
Murray Black.
We already know that children living in poverty experience poor physical and mental health, employment difficulties, stigma and chronic low self-esteem. And this creates problems not just for the individual but for government further down the line. So I wonder if the Minister would surprise us all and actually welcome the Scottish Government's introduction of the Scottish Child Payment later this year.
Well,
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable lady for her question, and I am looking very closely at this measure and its impact. And I would gently suggest to the honourable lady that this is in fact evidence of devolution working. I would say, Mr. Speaker, there is no monopoly on good ideas, and where the evidence suggests that a measure works, then we should of course explore it, and I will. And I would just stress, Mr. Speaker, I am committed to working with the Scottish Government to improve the life chances of people across Scotland, as I am across our whole United Kingdom.
Murray Black.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, and even more, if this is evidence of devolution working, I would like to remind them that this is why we want devolved all of the welfare powers to the Scottish Parliament. But once rolled out, this new payment will help roughly around 30,000 children out of poverty. So, if this is a good measure for the Scottish Government, can he tell us why his government is not following suit?
Hear.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I've probably already answered that question, but I will look at it very closely. But what I would say, Mr. Speaker, is if the Scottish Government is serious about addressing this issue of child poverty more broadly, then it should be making full use of the powers to reduce housing costs, improve earnings and enhance social security. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the Scottish Government has powers to tackle poverty through the devolution of skills, education, health and employment programmes. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, the UK Government does welcome the Scottish Government's child poverty strategy, and we look forward, and I indeed look forward to working very closely with my counterpart in the Scottish Government to ensure that we cover these devolved areas.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The child poverty payment is welcome, but does the Minister not share my concerns that the vast number of powers in relation to welfare matters, which the SNP and Scottish Government argued for, which were transferred in the 2016 Act, have not been taken forward. And in fact, some of them are now delayed until 2024. And isn't welfare just another victim of the Scottish Government's obsession with the Constitution and not focusing on the day job?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend and recognise his huge expertise in this area. All I would say, Mr. Speaker, is the Scottish Government and indeed the Government do want to address these issues, and I am absolutely committed to working with my counterparts in the Scottish Government to tackle child poverty and, in fact, poverty in all its forms.
Cat Smith.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 2 and 8 together. My department has regular engagement with the colleagues in BEIS on a range of issues relevant to Scotland, including the renewable energy sector.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland has a huge geographical advantage when it comes to wave and tidal energy, with reports suggesting that up to 40,000 jobs could be created in the sector if it had government support. Can I ask what work's been done in government to explore wave and tidal technology?
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right, and we do have an advantage on that, as we do on wind and obviously wind speeds and our mountains, and also with hydro schemes. We have advantage in all those things, and the government is supporting technology at universities. There's technology being investigated into for wave and tidal, and we're completely behind that should it prove to work.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend from Lancaster is absolutely right about the geographical advantage. What work is the government undertaking in terms of infrastructure, for example, interconnectors and storage, so that that clean, green energy that Scotland is able to generate can be shared with the rest of the United Kingdom?
Secretary of State.
As you know, the interconnectors is a devolved matter, but we absolutely are looking at, as best we can, to upgrading the schemes so that we can transfer our power across the United Kingdom, and the advantage that we have in Scotland in renewables and our growing renewable industry can benefit the whole of the UK.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will recall that when EDF were given the licence to develop the wind farm at Naguia, 10 miles off the Fife Coast, the commitment was that there would be created 1,000 jobs making the jackets for those wind turbines. Can the Secretary of State tell the House how many jobs have been created?
Secretary of State.
No, because I don't know the answer. But what I can tell you, that's a perfectly straight answer to a straight question. But what I can tell you is the sector deal aims to create 27,000 jobs by 2030. That's what the sector deal states.
Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell the Secretary of State how many jobs. 1,000 in Indonesia. Now, can the Secretary of State tell the House if the GMB union is right in saying that the transportation of these wind turbines from Indonesia to the Fife Coast will be the equivalent to 35 million cars on the road? How does that fit our commitment to greening this economy? But what confidence can people have in Scotland that jobs in a wind farm 10 miles off the Fife Coast will be created for people in Scotland and not people in Indonesia?
Secretary of State.
Well, that is the market economy, and we need to be better. We need to be better at pricing and better at producing our turbines. And that's the straight answer. I mean, these and many other issues we'll discuss when we bring COP26 to Glasgow later this year and to discuss the climate emergency. But I don't dispute with him, bringing turbines from Indonesia is not the answer. We need to find a better way of efficiently delivering them in the UK.
Colin McCartney.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you. We are 13 minutes in, Mr. Speaker, and I'm tempted to ask the Secretary of State, and it is to do with wind, because it was a windy day on Saturday, about the result when we won the Calcutta Cup. Oh, come on. You've got to be happy with that.
But I'm not.
The question was about wind, and we've had some balance of payments deficits, and the fact that lots of wind farms in Scotland get paid not to produce any electricity. Is that likely to take place later on this year?
Secretary of State.
Obviously, I disagree with him on the Calcutta Cup point. It goes without saying it was a wet and windy day and a miserable day at Murrayfield for me. As regards, I mean, what we're trying to do is improve the way wind works for Scotland. Contracts for difference allows certainty to the investors, it allows certainty over the longevity, it protects the consumers. And Mr. Speaker, I'd further add that in October 2019, When we did the last round of contracts for difference, 6 of the 12 awarded went to projects in Scotland.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can my right honourable friend update the House on what untapped capacity there is for using renewables in Scotland, and how many jobs would be created as a result of enhancing that capability?
Well, there is enormous capability, not just with more offshore wind schemes, but also with more schemes around hydro. And we do intend to create, as I said earlier, 27,000 more jobs through using that untapped capacity.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Much, Mr Speaker. Offshore wind and contract for difference round 3 was cost-free to both the government and the consumer, as the strike price was below the typical wholesale price. But 240 megawatts of that remains stranded because Ofgem demands that the island of Lewis has at least 349 megawatts to build an interconnector cable. There were another 180 megawatts that could have been consented to, it would have been cost-free, but they weren't consented to due to government caps. Can we have some joint-up thinking in the government between the interconnector and the contracts for difference to ensure we're not bellowing out fossil fuels and we could instead have 600 megawatts of wind being produced?
The honourable member for Nehelan and Yar makes a very fair point, and one of the things that I think the UK should look with future infrastructure and shared prosperity is about building that interconnector.
Sunderland.
Number 3, please, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Busy day. Mr Speaker, with permission, it appears I've woken a few people up, Mr Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 3 and 12 together. Scottish exports to the rest of the UK increased in 2018 by 1.2 billion to 51.2 billion. As a result, the rest of the UK continues to be Scotland's largest market for exports, accounting for 3 times the value of exports to the European Union.
Given the Minister's assessment, will he confirm that Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK is worth more than 3 times that with the EU? And this is only one of the benefits on offer of being part of the United Kingdom, not least for British firms.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, the Scottish Government's own figures show that Scotland's most important trading partner is the rest of the UK, and that is worth, as my honourable friend said, more than 3 times the trade with the other 27 EU countries combined. In other words, the Scottish Government's figures show that over 60% of Scotland's exports go to England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And indeed, I would argue, Mr Speaker, this is just one of the many benefits that Scotland has from being part of the United Kingdom.
Rick Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will my right honourable friend, given the excellent figures he has just given, share my concern that the separatist agenda peddled by the SNP is a direct threat to Scottish jobs, and it would inevitably end up, if they got their dreams come true, in a hard border?
I would absolutely agree with my honourable friend, Mr Speaker, that Nicola Sturgeon's separatist agenda is a real threat to Scotland's jobs, businesses and the economy. And that's why I'm against the First Minister's demand for another independence referendum, because we want 2020 to be a year of growth, stability and opportunity for Scotland and for the whole of the United Kingdom, whereas the SNP want 2020 to be a year of more political wrangling and wasteful debate.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labour MSP Monica Lennon has introduced the Period Products Bill to the Scottish Parliament to give free provision to women in Scotland. It's being opposed by the SNP government because of tampon raids from the English into Scotland to steal the products. If that is the case, what kind of border does the Secretary of State would be required in the event of an independent Scotland with a separate currency, a different regulatory environment and different provisions on trade?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman makes an exceptionally good point, and that is a border we need to avoid. It makes no sense in having any sort of border between Gretna and Berwick. And as to the SNP opposing that, and that opportunity to reduce VAT rates and other things that would help people, people on the poorest incomes, I simply don't understand what they're thinking.
Mr Carmichael.
The Secretary of State truly values the trade between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Why is he prepared to countenance a situation where we would lose frictionless trade between Scotland and Northern Ireland?
As the Prime Minister said, there will be unfettered access between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and indeed the rest of the United Kingdom.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Question 4.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Secretary and I regularly meet with the Secretary of State for Defence to discuss a range of issues of importance to Scotland, including maritime security.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Minister's own constituency, he will understand that there is an obvious breach point in the high north of Scotland for adversaries to come into, which has happened before. Can he assure the House that he will be engaging, the Scotland Office will be engaging fully with the upcoming integrated defence review, and will he agree to meet with me to discuss some of the issues that are important to him and to the rest of Scotland?
I'd be delighted to meet the honourable gentleman, and we can continue this discussion about the great investment by the UK Government into Scotland, into Murray. Last week we welcomed the first P8 aircraft, the Pride of Murray, touchdown at Kinloss, the first of 9. Huge investment by the UK Government and Boeing, and I have to put on record as well the outstanding work that local firm Robertsons have done in building the Poseidon facility.
David Dewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister update the House on what discussions he's had with the Minister of Defence in terms of fisheries protection, not just in enforcement of fisheries, but on monitoring as well?
Well, obviously that is a devolved issue, and I know DEFRA and other departments are in continued dialogue with the Scottish Government and others on this issue, but my honourable friend's long-standing commitment to the fishing industry has again been raised in this House, and I know he continues to stand up for his constituents in Banffin on that subject and many others.
Ronald Wardener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 5.
The UK Government ministers and officials have regular discussions with the Scottish Government on matters of importance, including the Scottish fiscal framework, Mr. Speaker. This historic arrangement delivers one of the most powerful and accountable devolved parliaments in the world, and it is up to the Scottish Government to use those powers wisely to further increase the economic prosperity of Scotland.
Ronald Wardener.
Does my right honourable friend agree that the Scottish Government's decision to make Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom is not only regrettable, but yet another broken promise by the SNP?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that I agree with my honourable friend. It is disappointing that Scottish taxpayers earning more than £27,000 will pay more tax in Scotland than they do in the rest of the UK. And I'd further say, Mr. Speaker, on earnings between £43,500 and £50,000, taxpayers in Scotland will pay 41% in income tax, compared to just 20% in the rest of the UK. And that means that a police officer with 10 years' experience, mid-30s, bringing up a family, on earnings between £43,500 and £50,000 will pay 21% more tax in Scotland than the rest of the UK.
Marion Bellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State acknowledge that for the third consecutive year, more than half of Scottish income taxpayers will pay less tax than if they live in the UK? Can he explain to these UK taxpayers why his government is ripping them off?
I would say to the honourable lady that that figure of less tax is correct. More than about 56% of Scots will pay less tax, and before the Scottish nationalists get over jubilant, I would point out that that's the grand amount of 40 pence per week.
Ruth Jones.
6, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now we've left the European Union, we are free to determine our own future, and we want 2020 to be a year of economic and social growth for Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has already stated in the Chamber today that the UK internal market represents the majority of Scotland's total export market, which means it is vital that the Secretary of State makes provision to develop and strengthen it. So can he confirm today that the government will prioritise the UK internal market over any future US-UK trade deal the Prime Minister wants with Donald Trump?
I absolutely can, because the UK internal market is so important for this country and Scotland. And not only the figures the Secretary of State has already mentioned today, but Scotland does 1.5 times more in trade to the rest of the UK than it does in the EU and the rest of the world combined.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The financial services sector is a major employer in my Chelmsford constituency and a major employer in Scotland. Will my honourable friend ensure that all parts of the Scottish economy are preserved and cared for in our future trade negotiations?
Absolutely. The future of Scotland's economy and the UK economy will be buoyant as we have left the European Union. We want to ensure all our sectors continue to thrive, and I can assure the Honourable Lady that we in the Scotland office will do everything possible to facilitate those discussions.
With the response we have heard from the front bench today might explain why he has lost half of his Scottish colleagues, why the SNP is at 51% in the polls, and why the majority of the Scottish people now want independence. But in the real world, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster says border checks are now inevitable for almost everybody because of their disastrous Brexit. How will this help Scottish business?
Minister. Well, the Honourable Gentleman speaks about the real world. Let's look at the real world in Scotland where the SNP are in power. We've got bridges that people can't get across. We've got hospitals that they can't open. We've got an education system failing. This is a record that the Scottish Government and the SNP will have to go to the people to in a little over 15 months' time. And I look forward to that election when the result of that will impact on what the Scottish Government and the SNP have done to Scotland since 2007.
7, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much. I'm busy today, Mr. Speaker. At the end of 2020, we automatically take control of our waters. This opens up a sea of opportunity for our fishing industry in Scotland and across the United Kingdom. As I've said before, this government will work tirelessly with our fishermen and coastal communities across Scotland.
Speaker, can my honourable friend confirm that by becoming an independent coastal state once again, we'll be able to deliver a better deal for fishermen across the United Kingdom, and ultimately we will control who fishes in our waters?
I can confirm that we'll no longer be bound by the EU's outdated and unfair method for sharing fishing opportunities. We'll set our own fishing quotas based on science and decide who can fish in our waters. And I have to say, I share my honourable friend's optimism for the future of our industry, and that is an optimism I have heard time and time again from fishermen and fishing communities the length and breadth of Scotland.
Stephen Bonner. Speaker, can the Secretary of State reveal the UK Government's stated intention of agreeing a mechanism of cooperation within the EU on fishing will include an extended agreement of access to waters as part of an EU trade deal?
Clearly, Mr. Speaker, we are in discussions about this going forward, but I have to say we have a positive vision for our fishing industry in Scotland now we have left the European Union. And how does that reflect on the vision of the SNP for fishing in Scotland? To take us back into the European Union, to be shackled once again by the common fisheries policy, something many Scots and many fishermen voted comprehensively to leave, and the SNP want to put us right back into it.
John Stevenson.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
I have regular discussions with all of my Cabinet colleagues on important issues around Scotland's economy, including the forthcoming budget in March. The Government will deliver a budget for Scotland's businesses and Scotland's people. It will set out ambitious plans to unleash Britain's potential and level up across the nations and regions of the UK.
John Stevenson.
Given the close economic relationship between the south of Scotland and the north of England, particularly within the Borderlands region, will the Minister give his support and make representation to the Chancellor in support of a free port at the Carlisle and Lake District Airport?
Secretary of State.
So I welcome the recent free ports announcement, and I've no doubt that free ports will unleash the potential of our proud historic ports, boosting and regenerating communities across the UK. And myself and other ministers on the front bench, and the Chancellor is here, have heard his early representations on behalf of his airport and his area. And not only is the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, a great champion for the Borderlands, he's also a great champion for Carlisle and the Lake District Airport.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page 64 of the 2015 Statement of Funding Policy document confirms that HS2 should have 100% market consequentials for Scotland. Will he ask for these market consequentials delivered in this budget, which is roughly £750 million, of which we spent to date in high-speed 2?
So I'd say to the honourable gentleman that there already has been a Barnett consequential around HS2 spending, And the next round, in the spending round, we will see what money is allocated to the Department for Transport, and that money will have a Barnett consequential.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over the weekend, Kingsbarns Distillery in my constituency won the Best Lowland Scotch 12 years and under at the World Whisky Awards. However, the impact of US tariffs continues to impede growth of the Scotch whisky industry in my constituency and across Scotland. Will the forthcoming budget include provisions to help our distilleries compete internationally despite these stifling tariffs?
Secretary of State.
Well, I know the Honourable Lady has a lot of experience in this, having formerly worked for Diageo, and I would say to her that these tariffs, these 25% tariffs on malt whisky, are a consequence of the Boeing-Airbus dispute between the EU and the USA. And in the next carousel, we hope to get, by having useful negotiations on a US trade deal, we want to get those tariffs removed.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Dr. Julian Lewis.
Will my right honourable friend kindly list his engagements for today?
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to join me in sending our deepest sympathies to all those affected by the weekend's flooding. My right honourable friend, the Local Government Secretary, has announced the activation of the Government's emergency Bellwin scheme to provide financial support for qualifying affected areas in the north of England, and we continue to work closely with our partners to help those affected and, above all, to keep people safe. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall further such meetings later today.
To Julian Lewis.
Closed question 1, Mr. Speaker, on the Defence and Security Review.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to transform the UK economy through the budget in March and the comprehensive spending review later this year. And the timing of that integrated review will be announced shortly.
To Julian Lewis.
I'm grateful for that reply, Mr. Speaker. May I urge the Prime Minister to recall what happened to the last combined security and defence review, which was done within a straitjacket of fiscal neutrality. It meant that every extra pound spent on cyber or security was a pound to be cut from the conventional armed forces. Therefore, will he try to ensure that the next attempt at a combined security and defence review will not face such a straitjacket and will be concluded before rather than after the comprehensive spending review?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand very well the point my right honourable friend makes, and I can assure him that the integrated review will be the deepest review of Britain's security, defence and foreign policy since the Cold War. And I can also assure him that by transforming this country's economy and by raising productivity, we will ensure that both defence and security are amply provided for.
Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister in expressing sympathy and support to those that are victims of flooding, and thank you to the Environment Agency and all the emergency services that are doing their best to help people. Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are also with those who suffer from the coronavirus and also with the Chinese community in this country, who are, I'm sorry to say, facing increasingly alarming levels of racism within our country. And as this virus spreads, I also want to thank public health workers who are helping those affected and raising awareness about the danger of this virus. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister think that someone who came to this country at the age of 5 and was the victim of county lines grooming and compelled to carry drugs, released 5 years ago and never reoffended, deserves to be deported?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole country would agree that while I cannot comment on individual cases, it is entirely right that foreign national offenders should be deported from this country in accordance with the law.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The government has learned absolutely nothing from the Windrush scandal. This cruel and callous government is trying to mislead the British people into thinking it's solely deporting foreign nationals who are guilty of murder, rape and other very serious offences. This is clearly not the case. Take the example of a young black boy who came to the UK aged 5 and is now being deported after serving time for a drugs offence. If there was a case of a young white boy with blonde hair who later dabbled in Class A drugs and conspired with a friend to beat up a journalist, would he deport that boy, or is it, Mr. Speaker, is it one rule for young black boys from the Caribbean and another for white boys from the United States?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think quite frankly that the right honourable gentleman demeans himself and, by the way, besmirches the reputation of the Windrush generation who came to this country to work in our public services, to teach our children in this country, to make lives better for the people of this country. He has no right to conflate them with those foreign national offenders that we are deporting today.
Jeremy Corbyn. The Windrush generation have been disgracefully treated by a government that deliberately created a hostile environment. And whilst the government was fighting to deport people who legally came to this country as children, the Foreign Secretary refused to tell the family of Harry Dunn the reason why the US is blocking the extradition of a woman who is alleged to have killed him. I now ask the Prime Minister straight this question. Is Anna Sakoulis being shielded from justice because she's a former CIA officer?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House will know that not only the Foreign Secretary but I, and at every level of government, we have tirelessly sought the extradition of Anna Sakoulis for justice in this country, and we will continue to do so.
It is widely reported that Anna Sakoulis is in fact a CIA operative. Now we know that the Foreign Secretary misled the Dunn family, who are being denied justice by the US government. Will the Prime Minister commit to his removal from office tomorrow in his reshuffle?
Prime Minister. What a stupid man. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows very well that the Foreign Office have been told that Anna Sakoulis was notified to the UK government as a spouse with no official role. And we will continue without fear or favour to seek justice for Harry Dunn and for his family. And we will continue to seek the extradition of Anna Sakoulis from the United States.
Jeremy Corbyn. This morning, Charlotte Charles, Harry's mum, said, "We thought we'd bridged the gap with the government, but they've not been honest with us."
Shame.
Mr. Speaker, this is only the latest case of our country's one-sided extradition treaty with the USA. This lopsided treaty means the US can request extradition in circumstances that Britain cannot. While the US continues to deny justice to Harry Dunn, will the Prime Minister commit today to seek an equal and balanced extradition relationship with the United States?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, to be frank, I think the honourable gentleman has a point in his characterisation of our extradition arrangements with the United States, and I do think that there are elements of that relationship that are unbalanced, and I certainly think that it is worth looking at. But that is totally different from the case of Harry Dunn and Anna Sakoulis, and we continue to seek the extradition of Anna Sakoulis to face justice in this country.
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, it's everything to do with the relationship with the USA that Anna Sakoulis has not been extradited back to Britain, because the US refuses to do it because of this lopsided treaty. I'm glad the Prime Minister at least acknowledges that. This deep disparity with the US is about to be laid bare when the courts decide whether the WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange will be extradited to the US on charges of espionage for exposing war crimes, the murder of civilians and large-scale corruption. Will the Prime Minister agree with the parliamentary report that's going to the Council of Europe that this extradition should be opposed and the rights of journalists and whistleblowers upheld for the good of all of us?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on any individual case, but it is obvious that the rights of journalists and whistleblowers should be upheld, and this government will clearly continue to do that.
Paul Hole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My wife is a volunteer with local Samaritans, and my right honourable friend will know what good work they do in helping keep people safe in Sedgefield and the rest of the UK online. Would my right honourable friend agree that today's announcement that we are putting Ofcom at the helm of a strong regulatory regime shows we are delivering on our commitment to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising that point, and as we deliver gigabit broadband to every part of this country, including to the people of Sedgefield, Mr. Speaker, we will also ensure that the UK is the safest place to be online.
In Blackfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In northern Syria, displaced women and their children are literally freezing to death. There are reports of babies dying due to the extreme conditions, and 45,000 people remain stranded with nowhere to go. Mr. Speaker, the Syrian war is considered to have caused the biggest wave of displacement since the Second World War. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what responsibility his government has taken for this humanitarian crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House will know what I think I've said several times in this House, that the UK leads the world in supporting the crisis and supporting humanitarian relief efforts in Syria. £3.2 billion this country has committed to that cause.
In Blackfoot.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about the children that are literally freezing to death. That wasn't an answer from the Prime Minister. And of course, in 2017, as Foreign Secretary, this Prime Minister enacted a policy of accepting the Syrian dictator Assad's rule over the country. Assad has delivered death and destruction on his people, a man who has gassed his own civilians. The humanitarian situation has reached crisis point, and there are now concerns of all-out war. Is the message the Prime Minister wants to send out from this House today that this UK government is washing its hands of the Syrian people, and that he is content for Assad's regime to continue enacting these atrocities?
I really think that the right honourable gentleman needs to consult his memory better, because he will find that this country and this government has persistently called for the end of the Assad regime, and indeed has led the world in denouncing the cruelty of the Assad regime towards his own people. That has been continuously the policy of the British government.
Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in supporting a new initiative that I'm launching in my constituency of Watford to train mental health first aiders across schools, workplaces and the community, across the whole constituency, to tackle loneliness and challenge mental health stigma? And perhaps, if I may I ask if he could find time in his diary to join me at the launch? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to champion mental health services in Watford, and we are massively increasing support for good mental health in schools. And if I can, I will do my best to come to the launch of his event.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 3 years of extensive evidence gathering and research, on the 26th of March, the Youth Violence Commission will publish its final recommendations. The overwhelming verdict from victims, youth workers, community leaders and other stakeholders is that short-term solutions do not work. Violence reduction units are a welcome first step, but they need long-term funding and leadership from the top. Will the Prime Minister commit to this funding, and will he attend our report launch and to hear direct from victims and experts about how we get to grips with this crisis?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do think that she's right that you've got to do both, and that's why we're also putting £200 million into the Youth Endowment Fund, as well as supporting violence reduction units. But we're also, Mr. Speaker, putting 20,000 police on the streets of this country and giving them the powers which that gentleman opposes to take knives off the streets with stop and search.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister has made transport connectivity a main priority for this government. Would he agree with me that connecting my constituent of Southport with Preston through the Burscough Curve link would not only give my constituents greater access to the rail network, but would help us to unleash our economic potential?
Prime Minister! Well, I congratulate my honourable friend on what he's done and to campaign for the restoration of the Burscough Curves, and it sounds to me like a great idea. And I will make sure, what he needs to do is put forward a costed business plan, and I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will be looking at it very carefully.
Sean Hodge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me and 10,800 of my constituents who signed petitions that the building of a gasification plant in Washington would be terrible for the people of Sunderland due to the public health concerns, air quality, and would indeed be a blot on the landscape of Sunderland? That now is a frequent visitor to Sunderland. I'm sure he shares my concerns on this matter, and will he therefore support me and my constituents who oppose the building of this plant?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I will certainly look into the matter that she raises, and we will make sure, of course, that if there is a problem with the gasification plant that she describes, that Sunderland continues to prosper and to lead the UK economy.
Bill Levy.
Has the potential to become one of the most strategically important ports in the UK for the export of renewable technology as well as wind turbines. Will my right honourable friend consider visiting Blyth, where I'm sure he'll get a warm northern welcome, and see for himself the strength of Blyth to become a free port?
I think he had the answer ready.
Sorry, the answer was in the question, Mr Speaker, and he makes an excellent point about the potential of Blyth, though I must remind him that the allocation of free ports will be decided in an entirely fair and transparent way.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Every day, an estimated 280 shop workers will be victims of violence at work. At my local co-op, a staff member was hit with a glass bottle. Now, the co-op's a good employer and want that to stop. So they and other local retailers engaged with the government's call for evidence around violence towards shop staff. 7.5 months later, they are awaiting a response. Prime Minister, will you commit today to publish your response to the call to evidence, and will you meet with me and a group of shop workers who have experienced violence at work to hear about what happened to them?
Minister.
I certainly will make that undertaking to the honourable gentleman. I'm glad he raised it. We should not tolerate crimes of violence against shop workers or indeed anybody else. And therefore, I find it paradoxical that the leader of his party is soft on the deportation of serious violent offenders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This year we mark the 75th anniversaries of VE Day and VJ Day. As we honour those who have served our country, can my right honourable friend outline how his new Office of Veterans Affairs is giving our veterans and, their families the support they deserve?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I can tell him that our new Office of Veterans Affairs is helping veterans to transition to new jobs, to secure a home. A discount rail card will be rolled out by Armistice Day, and veterans will get guaranteed interviews for civil service jobs, so we have more veterans bringing their talents to government.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. His junior Scotland Office Minister told the National Farmers Union last week that substandard food will be allowed into the UK under a US trade deal, but it will have to be labelled as such. Now, the Prime Minister has denied that in the past. So who's telling the truth, and which of them doesn't know what's coming?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I can assure the honourable lady that the UK has and will continue to have the highest standards in the world for our food.
Grace Green.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In Greater Manchester, frontline police officers are increasingly having to resort to using a pen and paper because of the failing IOPS computer system. This is putting the police at risk and also undermining their ability to protect residents and vulnerable children. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, intervene to solve this problem?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is, I'm afraid, entirely right, and we know there are concerns about this system. That's why I've asked our right honourable friend, the Police and Crime Minister, to ask Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary for an independent review of the operation of the system, and we'll make sure that my honourable friend is kept informed.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northwick Park Hospital, which serves my constituents, has not met its 4-hour A&E target since August 2014. It's been starved of capital investment, is short of ITU beds, and is expected to have close to a £100 million deficit by the end of the financial year, one of the highest in the NHS. When can the Prime Minister expect Northwick Park to receive a little government love and attention?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman raises an important point, but as you will know, the highest number of people ever attended A&E in this country last month, 2 million people. The demand is exceptional. I pay tribute to the work of NHS staff, and we are responding in this government, as he knows, with a record investment in the NHS, £34 billion, and we are recruiting the nurses, 50,000 more of them, that will help to deal with that crisis.
Imran Nabad Khan.
In the last week, Storm Kira has wreaked havoc along the whole of West Yorkshire's Calder Valley, affecting the constituencies of members across the House. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, seek to find time to visit my constituency, where Horbury Bridge, the place at which onward Christian soldiers were penned, has been acutely affected, and see for himself the terrible damage done to people's homes, lives and businesses? Will he tread where the saints of our communities and emergency services have trod and continue to toil undivided towards recovery?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I obviously pay tribute to the emergency services for what they are doing in my honourable friend's constituency and indeed in all the flood affected areas. As he knows, we have activated the Bellwyn scheme to protect homeowners. We're putting £4 billion into flood defences, and I certainly will do what I can to take up his offer to visit his constituencies and see the scene for myself.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new daily allowance for the unelected and unaccountable peers being stuffed into the House of Lords by the Prime Minister is set to rise to £323. Yep. The monthly allowance for a single person over 25 on universal credit is £317.82.
Listen to the question, Boris.
Is that the levelling up the Prime Minister keeps talking about?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, I hate agreeing with these people. Actually, I do find that it is odd that the House of Lords has chosen to do that, but it is a decision for them.
Holly Latham.
Instrumental in getting the ban on trade in ivory in this country. Would he be as equally decisive in getting rid of the trophies coming into this country, imported particularly of endangered animals?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for what she's doing to campaign against illegal wildlife trading and trophy hunting, and we mean to end the import of trophies hunted elsewhere into this country.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, Lyubov Chernyukin, the wife of Vladimir Putin's former Deputy Finance Minister, paid £20,000 for lunch with the then Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, who we believe is soon to be ennobled. Could the Prime Minister remind the House once more why his government is yet to publish the Intelligence and Security Committee's report into alleged Russian interference in UK politics?
Prime Minister.
Well, as I think he knows very well, the report will be published as soon as the Intelligence and Security Committee is reconvened. And I think, as I've told the House several times before, those of a conspiratorial cast of mind will be disappointed by its findings.
Adam Frey.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Prime Minister for the belief he has in Britain and the massive boost to investment in infrastructure around the country. But with the landing fees at £25 per passenger at Heathrow Airport, and with a third runway, those fees will rise. Heathrow Airport will become the least competitive airport on the entire planet. So can I, given the delays and the escalating costs, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he agree that it may well be time to review progress and to perhaps deploy those bulldozers elsewhere in the country?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons voted to give an outline planning consent effectively to the third runway. I know a measure that is supported by people across this chamber, not by me, as it happens. I wait to see the outcome of the various legal processes that are currently underway to see whether the promoters of the third runway can satisfy their legal obligations under air quality and indeed noise pollution.
Bridget Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2015, the number of GPs working in Sunderland has fallen by 16%, much higher than the national average. After almost a decade of Tory control, our GP services are inadequate and getting worse. Who does the Prime Minister hold responsible for that?
Prime Minister.
Well, we're of course responsible, and we take full responsibility, but overall numbers are up of GPs, and we are now recruiting 6,000 more, and we're able to do that because we're running a sound economy and investing massively in our NHS across the whole country.
Robert Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As coronavirus hits the headlines every day, would the Prime Minister join me in thanking and paying tribute to the supreme professionalism of those at Public Health England and in my area at RAF Bryce Norton for bringing home people who've been affected? Their work is often unremarked, but is the admiration of all of us.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend puts it absolutely beautifully, and I salute everybody who's involved in bringing home victims and potential victims of coronavirus, the difficulties and the risks that they face, and indeed our NHS, who I think have so far done an outstanding job in preparing and informing the country.
Thanks.
Sir Edward Davey.
When Kevin Simpson's partner of over 12 years died and his 2 children lost their mother, the family received no bereavement support payments at all. Because the parents were unmarried, the law denied that support to the 2 grieving children. Last Friday, the High Court ruled that this breached the children's human rights. So when will the government obey the rule of law and legislate to respond both to that ruling and the similar ruling by the Supreme Court in the McLaughlin case in 2018? Will there be no further delay so we can start supporting the thousands of similar children across our country who lose their mother and father every year?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman has raised this with me before, and I've undertaken to meet him on that matter. We will certainly look at the case he mentions and see what exactly our response should be, but he is right to draw attention to this injustice, and we will do what we can to remedy it.
Jacob Young.
On Thursday last week, 2 people were stabbed in Redcar in broad daylight. Another person was injured in a horrific knife crime on Saturday evening outside a busy nightclub. Figures released by the Ministry of Justice in January show that Cleveland Force area has the highest number of knife and offensive weapon offences per head of population in all of England and Wales. What additional support can my right honourable friend give to Cleveland Police to tackle this problem, and when will we start to see more police on the streets of Teesside?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising it, because knife crime is intolerable and its recent rise must be combated. That's why we've brought in knife prevention orders, which give the police the powers where they suspect a knife crime is about to be committed to take the interventions that they need. That's why we're putting 20,000 more police on our streets with the encouragement and the political support that they need to carry out stop and search.
The Oxford-Cambridge so-called expressway was a 20th century road building solution to a 21st century challenge, and at the election Labour rightly pledged to scrap it. I wonder if the Prime Minister's caught up with us, and could he announce today whether that has finally been put to rest and scrapped?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the honourable gentleman to wait, to contain his impatience until the budget, and he will learn more about the National Infrastructure Plan.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the Prime Minister's decision yesterday to go ahead with HS2, though I have to tell him that there is little enthusiasm among my constituents for it because it does nothing to improve connectivity to Cleethorpes. To build up enthusiasm amongst the people of Cleethorpes, could I urge the Prime Minister to instruct LNER to reintroduce the direct train service from Cleethorpes through to King's Cross, to make the Gainsborough Brig to Cleethorpes service, which is at present 1 day a week, into a 7-day service, to manufacture the rails at Scunthorpe, and of course to reopen Suggett's Lane level crossing.
Mr. Speaker, the voice of Cleethorpes has been heard, and he's made a vivid and compelling case. As I stood up to answer, the Chancellor whispered in my ear that we would certainly be looking at it in the infrastructure review.
Speaker, the prosperous future of our young people all too often depends on their family well-being and school readiness. That requires investment in early years. Does the Prime Minister regret the Conservative cuts to around 1,000 Sure Start centres, including in my constituency? And will he commit to greater funding and support for early years development, particularly in our most deprived communities?
Prime Minister.
Well, she raises an important point. That's why we're putting record sums now into early years funding, £14 billion going into education, and it is under this government that you will see the biggest improvements. It's under this government. It's under this government that we have a robust, strong, dynamic economy, the third fastest growing in the G7, and we are able to make those investments in early years precisely because of our sensible management of the economy.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the PFI deal signed by the last Labour government to build hospitals like King's Mill in Ashfield at a cost of £1 million a week is nothing short of a national scandal? And can he please ensure that this never happens again?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, it is one of the many scandals of the last Labour government that the PFI deals, from memory, the PFI deals that they did, saddled the taxpayer with £80 billion worth of debts in exchange for £12 billion worth of hospital assets. That's how Labour run government. That's how Labour run the economy. Let's not let it happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister bring to an end the sickening outrage of a witch hunt against former police officers who served Ulster through the heat of the Troubles and are now going to face the most odious prosecutions for non-criminal misconduct? That wouldn't be tolerated in this part of the United Kingdom. It shouldn't be tolerated in my part of the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will make sure that we give support for all those who face unnecessary prosecution, and I'm well aware of the issue that he raises.
Point of order, Barbara Keeley.
Mr. Speaker, today the Equality and Human Rights Commission has started legal action against the Department of Health and Social Care for their failure to move 2,200 autistic people and people with learning disabilities out of inappropriate inpatient units. Separately, we have the government's response to the Learning Disabilities Mortality Review, a review that has shockingly found that people with learning disabilities are dying on average 25 years earlier than the rest of the population. It seems that improving care for people with learning disabilities and autistic people is not a priority for this government, as we've had no statement in the House on these important issues from the government so far. Mr. Speaker, have you had an indication that a minister plans to make a statement on these important issues?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for giving me notice on this important matter, but I would say it's not a point of order for the Chair. It is for government departments to make statements, and I'm sure that people will have listened to what the honourable members had to say, but it is certainly not for me, but for others to come forward with a statement. Right. If not, we now go to Business of the day is the Terrorist Offenders Restriction of Early Release Bill, business of the House motion. I should inform the House that I have selected a manuscript amendment to the motion in the name of Alistair Carmichael to insert after the paragraph bracket 6, brackets B, an additional sub-paragraph as follows. The question on any amendment, new clause or new schedule selected by Chair or Speaker for separate decision. I now call the Minister to move.
Move formally.
The question is that terrorist restriction... Oh, do you want... Shut it. Put the question. Yep. The question is that the terrorist restriction early bill, the Business House motion is ordered on the paper. The debate now may take place. Alistair Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the manuscript amendment standing in my name. The Minister will be aware that the business motion that he has just moved without any explanation whatsoever replicates the provision of Standing Order 83D faithfully in every respect bar one. That is, it omits the contents of paragraph 83D, subparagraph 2C. That provides that at the conclusion of proceedings, the question may be put on any amendment, new clause or new schedule selected by Chair for separate decision. The effect of the omission of that provision from the business motion before the House is that if debate continues until the conclusion of the time allowed in this business motion, then there will be no division on any amendments moved in the course of that committee stage. And I think at the very least the House is entitled to hear an explanation from the Treasury bench as to why we should see your power restricted in this way, Mr. Speaker. Now, it may be that ultimately this is all academic. It may be that we will conclude proceedings before the expiry of time, or it may be that there will be simply no amendment that anybody is wanting to put at the conclusion of proceedings. But there remains, however, a very important point of principle at stake here, and the point is that surely we should hear the debate first before we make decisions of that sort. And if it is the will of the House at the conclusion of the time allowed, then you, Mr. Speaker, should have the power from the Chair so to put any question. I think it is entirely regrettable that the Minister, in moving this, did not offer any explanation to the House as to why the Government, through us, seek to fetter your power in this way. I also think it is worth bearing in mind that what the Government is doing today in bringing a bill forward, going through all stages in one day, is, while it is not by any means unusual, still something that is quite extraordinary. The Government relies on cooperation from all parts of the House in order to do that. They have had that cooperation, so why now do they seek to restrict the power that you have to call divisions at the end of the committee stage?
The original question was that the Tourist Offenders brackets, Restriction of Early Release brackets, Bill business of the House motion as on the order paper, since when an amendment has been moved as follows. After paragraph bracket 6, brackets B, insert. Brackets BA, the question on the amendment, the new clause or new schedule selected by the Chairman or Speaker for a separate decision. The question is, the amendment be made. Robert Butler.
Well, I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. I've listened very carefully to the right honourable gentleman, who I know speaks with years of experience, shall we say, as somebody who had direct responsibility, at least in part, for this during his time in coalition. I would say simply this to him. Whilst I'm not accusing his approach of being an unreasonable one, we do view this as meeting the test of reasonableness, bearing in mind that these are exceptional circumstances. This is not something that we would depart from lightly. We want to make sure that the time that we have for actual debate is maximised. I think that's important, bearing in mind we know, the the issue with regard to divisions, and for those reasons we would judge it appropriate on this occasion to depart. I know he's not going to probably accept the explanation I give to him, but at least the very fact he's made this manuscript amendment, although I do note that from other parts of the House we've not met the same objection, the fact that he's put that amendment down has made the government explain its position. These are exceptional circumstances, and for those reasons I would beg him respectfully to withdraw the amendment that stands in his name.
I've got to put the question now. Okay. The question is that the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no.
No. Division, clear the lobby. Just sit down. The question is the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Jamie Stone and Christine Jardine. For the noes, Nigel Huddleston and James Morris.
Order! Order.
The ayes to the right, 51. The noes to the left, 316.
Touch and go.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. The ayes to the right, 51. The noes to the left, 316. The noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. Thank you. The question is the terrorist offenders, brackets, restriction of early release. close brackets, Bill, Business the House motion, as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Terrorist Offenders Restriction of Early Release Bill, second reading.
No.
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 Order, order. Minister to move second reading. Minister Robert Buckland.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the Terrorist Offenders Restriction of Early Release Bill be now read a second time. Twice in the last few months, we've seen appalling and senseless attacks on members of the public by terrorist offenders. At Fishmongers Hall on the 30th of November of last year, 2 bright, promising young lives were cut heartbreakingly short. The perpetrator, Usman Khan, was released automatically halfway through a 16-year sentence for preparing terrorist acts. That tragedy was made so much more poignant by the fact that these victims were dedicated to the rehabilitation of offenders, helping people to get their lives back on track. The attack in Streatham on the 2nd of February of this year came as a stark reminder of the risks when these sort of offenders are let out automatically before they've served their full sentence in prison.
Would my right honourable friend give way on that one?
I'll give way.
I'm so grateful for my right honourable friend for giving way. There are, of course, a number of people who may question why we are rushing through this business in one day today. So may I ask my right honourable friend, if the business were not to be completed today and the bill enabled as an act, would it result in terrorists being released early in the immediate future?
Minister.
The simple answer, Mr. Speaker, is yes. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his intervention. I was telling the House about the events of Streatham. Sudesh Aman had been released just 1 week before the attack, halfway through a 3-year and 4-month sentence for offences related to distributing or promoting material intended to stir up religious hatred. The automatic nature of his release meant that there was no parole oversight and no decision as to whether or not he posed a risk to the public. No one could prevent his release. It is purely thanks to the swift intervention of our incredible police officers that he did not go on to commit even more harm before he was stopped with necessary force. The reality is that we face an unprecedented threat from terrorist offenders who are willing, Mr. Speaker, to commit random violence without any fear of the consequences. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome the work that he has done in this area over the last few weeks and also presenting this bill here today. But would he also concede that this form of jihadi extremism and the threat that it has posed is now here, has been around us for almost 20 years since the horrible attacks in 9/11 and, of course, Bali in 2002. I absolutely welcome the extra funding for our counter-terrorism police, rehabilitation and the probation services. This is all very good news. But ultimately, we have to ask ourselves why these people indoctrinated in the first place. Would he agree with me that we need to do more to remove that harmful online content which is used so much to attract people to this dark place that they go to?
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with particular personal experience of the Bali atrocity, and he is right to talk about the long-term nature of the threat. But it is a threat that changes, and a threat that evolves. And this government will be as fleet of foot as possible in responding to those changes. And he'll be glad to note that when it comes to online content, we are working at pace in order to remove inappropriate and hateful content and to deal with it. The Home Secretary is in her place by my side today to emphasise in the most eloquent possible way the joint approach that both she and I and our respective departments, together with the security services and the police, take with regard to what is the first duty of government, protecting the public. It is a grave responsibility from which we will not shirk, and we say that enough is enough, Mr. Speaker, and I think I'm being... Yes, and I'll take the right honourable gentleman's intervention.
I'm very glad at the tone he's taking. Were this measure to be challenged in our courts and the government to lose, that would be merely declaratory. But if it made its way to the court in Strasbourg and the government were to lose there, the ministerial code would require him to abide by treaty law. Would he then entertain the prospect of a derogation from the convention?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but I believe that the declaration that I made on the front of this bill speaks for itself. This is a bill that is... Well, I haven't finished developing the point yet. This is a bill, and I will, of course, give way to my eager honourable friend, the chair of the Justice Select Committee, but this is a bill on which I've made the following statement, that in my view the provisions of the bill are compatible with convention rights. I take his point. I'm not going to anticipate litigation in domestic courts or indeed in Strasbourg, but I will say this now, and I will repeat it for the benefit of the record, Mr. Speaker, that it is my firm view that this bill does not engage the provisions of Article 7 of the European Convention, because it relates to the way in which the sentence is administered, not a change in the nature of the penalty itself. And I'm grateful to him for allowing me to say that now, and I'll give way to my honourable and eager friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, because it is an important point. Will he confirm that in coming to that conclusion and making that certification, he has taken the advice of Senior Treasury Counsel? And will he also confirm that it's very clear from subsequent decisions that the case law has made it quite clear that the administration of a sentence is not part of the penalty, and finally, that even were there to be, which I do not believe to be the case, successful litigation, this could result only in a declaration of incompatibility. It cannot, in fact, strike down primary legislation.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to remind the House that when it comes to primary legislation, there is no power to strike down that type of legislation. I won't, I'm afraid, indulge him in a direct answer as to the nature of advice that may or may not have been tendered. He knows the reasons for that, but I can reassure him that all the proper mechanisms have been employed and engaged in the preparation of this bill, and that on the basis of all the information received, I was able with high certainty to make the declaration on the frontiers piece. And I will give way to my right honourable friend, the former Security Minister, in due course.
Grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, who he will remember that we worked together on these matters in government. He's right to speak about the metamorphosis of terrorism. And will he now confirm, and indeed these provisions underpin this, that we must never let the persistent and perverse advocacy of the rights of murderous individuals compromise either the work of our security services or public faith in the rule of law?
Yes, sound point.
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with considerable experience as we work together on the Investigatory Powers Bill, a bill that I think rightly struck the balance between the need to protect the public and to make sure that the rule of law was respected. It perhaps gives me a chance to warm to a theme that I make no apology. I will give way in a moment. I haven't finished. I'm warming. I'm warming to a theme. I will give way. Let me warm. The theme is this. In our fight against terrorism, in our determination to protect the public against those who spread hate, division and death and injury, irrespective of what might motivate them, because we know we have a cohort of different types of terrorists, it means that we are defending something of value, Mr. Speaker. We're defending a democratic, free society. We're defending the rule of law. We're defending the values of this place and indeed the values of all the people that we have the honour and privilege of representing. That's something that's worth defending, and by using due process, we mark ourselves out as distinct from, as better than, as different from those who seek to divide us. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend, the member for Stone.
Is my
right honourable friend in receipt of advice from the Attorney General on this question and the law officers. And I say this simply for this reason, that whatever the arguments he may address with regard to compatibility and his statement on the face of the bill, the reality is that this could easily end up in the courts if they can possibly manufacture an argument. And I just simply want to be quite clear that his advice relates to the action in the courts and not just the incompatibility.
I'm grateful to my old friend. I can assure him that all the usual processes were followed. I'm not going to go into the weeds of what the law officers might have said. We know they have a particular function when it comes to the necessary clearances for the introduction of a bill. I can assure him that those processes have been followed and that the issues that he rightly outlines and indeed presages through his amendment are ones that are very much in the uppermost of our considerations. I was explaining to the House, Mr. Speaker, and I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the Lord Chancellor, yes, for giving way. And indeed, the recent events have shown the need for a review of this legislation, which I certainly do support, and which has, I think, appropriate safeguards and implementation measures that will be debated today. He made a point earlier about victims as well, and a member of somebody who had done work experience in my office was a witness on that day who was working at Fishmongers Hall, and so the impact not just on those who were injured or killed, but on those who were there and their families has been tremendous and continues. But if I can just ask him this point, the provisions in the bill, I understand, change the release point for offenders who have committed a relevant terrorism offence and refers those offenders to the parole board at 2/3 of the points of the sentence. I think we can understand and acknowledge that the resources available to police and probation is also a critical part of this, that changing the legislation won't be enough. Is he also committed to making sure that the resources required through the justice system will be in place to make any change effective on the ground?
I'm very grateful to the honourable lady, and indeed I pay tribute to everybody who not only was involved with but who witnessed those awful events at Fishmongers Hall. And she and I served on the Justice Select Committee for some time together. I know she's had a long-term interest in these issues. She's right to ask about resources. Several announcements were made some weeks ago when it was announced that we would be introducing a counter-terrorism bill. Extra resources of 90 million for counter-terrorism activity were additional to the overall package of £900 million of support for counter-terrorism. But when it comes to what we're doing with probation and those interventions that she's referred to, again, we announced extra resources, a doubling in the number of specialist probation officers. I'm still developing the point. Doubling the number of specialist probation officers and indeed introducing more expert psychiatric and imam involvement. She can be rest assured that whatever resources are needed in order to deal with this issue, we will devote them to this particular line of important, intensive work. I will give way to my honourable friend from Stafford.
Thank you. The convicted Staffordshire-born terrorist Usman Khan was let out of prison early on licence. Less than a year after his release, he killed 2 young people near London Bridge last November. So does the Minister agree that this illustrates why this bill is so important to protect the public in my constituency and across the UK and ensure that the most dangerous criminals do serve the prison time that they deserve?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She rightly points out the sad local connection to that appalling case last year. And I know she shares my, and indeed I think the whole House's commitment to the maximum amount of effort when it comes to protecting the public. Because it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that we must put a stop to the current arrangements where a dangerous terrorist can be released from prison by automatic process of law before the end of their sentence. And we must do so as quickly as possible. I'll give way to my right honourable friend from Basingstoke.
And I thank the Lord Chancellor for giving way, and I warmly welcome this legislation that's been put before the House today. But he's talking about resources. Could he outline for the House any estimates he's made of the number of individuals that might be covered by this legislation, so that we can understand perhaps the impact that this could have had on our police forces if those individuals had been released from prison early?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. The number of offenders, either terrorist offenders or offenders who committed offences with a terrorist link, is around 50. It doesn't sound like a large cohort, but in this particular situation of extreme gravity, we cannot afford to allow any further incidents to happen. Now, I've spoken about the need to minimise risk. That does not mean that I can eliminate risk, but this is why this emergency measure is, in my judgment and the judgment of the government, absolutely necessary if we are to meet the concerns that she and other honourable and right honourable members have. I'd like to, can I just make some progress, and then I will give way further, of course. I'll make, forgive me, my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's just raised this issue of risk. He's absolutely right to be addressing, and the government's right to be addressing this question of the automatic early release of terrorist offenders. But terrorist offenders will still be released at some point. And that is why the issue of rehabilitation, the work that is done both in prison and when they are out of prison, is so important. There has been many efforts at this over the years, but as recent incidents have seen, that has not always been with success. Does my right honourable friend agree that actually we will never deal with this issue of terrorism until we deal with the ideology that drives it? And will he reassure me that the government is taking extra efforts to find new paths to ensure that we can turn people away from the extremism and the terrorism that takes other people's lives?
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with unparalleled experience of these issues, both as Home Secretary and Prime Minister, and I can assure her, and I will develop these issues later in my speech, that there is a constant, if you like, a self-questioning amongst those responsible for these particular programmes to make sure that they are properly calibrated, that they understand the particular drivers that mean that people are compelled to commit these acts, and that the different distinctions between the types of offender that we see, and there are, and she'll know from her own case experience, the myriad of different motivations are fully understood, and that rather than a blanket approach being taken, a case-by-case analysis is indeed very much at the heart of how we approach these matters. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's absolutely right that this legislation ending the automatic halfway point of release is the correct thing to do. The Parole Board still has, obviously, in this process, a very important role. What does he envisage in terms of reform of the Parole Board to make it more accountable? Because that is a key aspect of ensuring that citizens are kept safe from those who would cause them harm.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he will be reassured that indeed a lot of ongoing work continues with regard to the role of the Parole Board. So very recently reforms were introduced that allow me to ask the Parole Board to reconsider important decisions that they make with regard to the early release or the release of offenders. And secondly, there is currently a tailored review being undertaken to make sure that its work is as practically effective as possible. And indeed in the manifesto we committed to a root and branch review to look at issues about the involvement of victims, to make sure that they are aware and are as involved as possible from the outset, and that secondly we make sure that the sharing of intelligence and information between either the security services or indeed the police and the Parole Board is as thorough and comprehensive as possible, so that the fullest and most appropriate assessment of risk can be made. And in this particular area, counter-terrorism, nothing can be more important, Mr. Speaker, than making sure that that intelligence is shared and that those who handle it have the appropriate clearances and the appropriate expertise in order to make that necessary assessment. I can see my honourable friend. I will give way to the honourable lady from Stretford and Urmston first, and then the Isle of Wight.
I'm very grateful to the Lord Chancellor, and he rightly mentions the need for resources to support this new legislation, because, as others have noted, albeit potentially later than now, most of these offenders will eventually be released into the community. The issue is not just one of resources, it's also of process and expertise, because the recall provisions that are in place now could potentially have been of use in the cases that we have seen in the recent months. Can he assure me that the government is also looking at training, at process, and that any reforms that may be needed, for example, to recall processes, are properly put in place to support this legislation?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady with whom I served on the Justice Select Committee. She's right to talk about risk assessment and indeed the recall process. She knows that the recall process actually can be triggered on arrest and certainly on charge, and that in the normal course of events that is something that is regularly done. When it comes to the multi-agency public protection issue and the MAPPA approach, she'll note, I think, with pleasure the fact that only 3 weeks ago the Home Secretary and I ordered a review. It's to be conducted by Jonathan Hall, QC, who is the government's independent review of terrorism. He will be looking at the MAPPA arrangements with regard to this high-risk, high-level sector of the cohort in order to make sure that we are really getting it right and that the appropriate expertise is deployed at the right time in order to make the finest judgment with regard to risk. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
If I understand correctly, there are about 220 terrorists, people serving time for terrorist offences, 50 of which, my right honourable friend said, are going to be affected by this. Is that because those 50 are up for imminent release within the next period of a few months? And does it in principle apply to all 220 terrorist-related offenders in prison?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. The cohort of around 50 relate to automatic early release. The rest, of course, will be subject to parole board assessment. The different types of sentences that are available. We're talking about people on standard determinate sentences. There are other types of sentences, the extended determinate sentence. There will be some who are maybe still on what we call the historic IPP regime. There's offences of particular concern, the Spock offences. As you can see, a number of, forgive me for the alphabet soup, but I'm afraid criminal justice sentencing legislation has not been the easiest matter for us to deal with, either as legislators or certainly when I was a practitioner in this area. I will give way before I develop the point.
I'm very grateful for his being hugely generous. I would like to ask the Lord Chancellor whether he accepts that whilst a lot of these people are clearly terrorists and criminals, a significant number of them are clearly insane. And the people who were in jail with the latest perpetrator said that that individual was plainly off his head, and he did indeed have a history of drug abuse, and mind-altering substances clearly played a role. Therefore, why is it that if people are secular and criminally insane, they will be locked up indefinitely, but if they can ascribe this to some sort of religious motive, we feel we have to give them a finite sentence and release them when they might run amok at any stage?
Well, as ever, my right honourable friend makes a very interesting and thought-provoking point. Whilst I won't go into the individual facts of this case, because of course it is subject to a police investigation, bearing in mind we have an ongoing inquiry, I will say this, that of course the judgment as to mental health or a mental health disorder within the meaning of the Mental Health Act 1983 is a matter for two Section 12 qualified clinicians, consultant psychiatrists who will have produced clinical evidence that will satisfy a court of the provisions of Section 37 of the Act, or indeed a restriction under Section 41, which then puts the power of release into my hands, that has to be satisfied on the basis of evidence. I think it's important to make a distinction between that clinical approach and the risk assessment that we have to undertake when it comes to those who profess political motivation. It's thought-provoking in this sense that we do need to think about a mechanism that would be robust, that would be legally sound, but which would allow an objective assessment to be made about the risk posed by individuals, even after their sentence has been completed, because public protection has to very much come into the forefront of our thinking. I will now develop what we have done operationally, Mr. Speaker, since the attack at Streatham. The Prison and Probation Service has taken immediate action to strengthen our operational grip of terrorist offenders and to protect the public from any further attacks. And the National Probation Service is working very closely with counter-terrorism partners, and several offenders on licence have been recalled to prison since the attack, where officers identified concerning behaviour. And I think that leans into the point made by the Honourable Lady from Stretford and Urmston. We've also instructed prison governors to report any concerns and to take any action required. Several terrorist prisoners have subsequently been placed in segregation units as a result of concerns raised by prison staff. And the prison service is managing the risk of incidents in prisons that may be inspired by or in response to the attack at Streatham. I'd like to put on record my thanks to Ian Aitchison for his 2016 report on our response to extremism in prisons. In the intervening years, the operating context has changed and our response has strengthened considerably, but we must go further and will take all additional steps necessary, including keeping the full list of recommendations in Mr Aitchison's internal report under careful review. However, Mr Speaker, we need to take further action urgently to ensure that the public are protected. We cannot have the situation, as we saw in the Streatham attack, where an offender, a known risk to the public, is released without any oversight by the parole board. The bill therefore sets out new release arrangements for prisoners serving a sentence for a terrorist offence or an offence with a terrorist connection. There are two main elements to this. First, to standardise the earliest point at which they may be considered for release at 2/3 of the sentence imposed, and secondly, to require that the parole board assess whether they are safe to release between that point and the end of their sentence. This will apply to all terrorist and terrorist-related offences where the maximum penalty is above 2 years, including those offences for which Sudesh Oman was sentenced. Only a very small number of low-level offences, such as failure to comply with a police cordon, are excluded by this threshold, and prosecution and conviction for those offences are rare. The changes affect those who are serving sentences for a specified offence, whether the sentence was imposed before or after the new section comes into force. Applying this to serving prisoners reflects the unprecedented gravity of the situation we face and the danger that is posed to the public. The bill won't achieve its intended effect unless it operates with retrospective effect. Therefore, it will necessarily operate on both serving and future prisoners. This doesn't mean that the bill will change retrospectively the sentence imposed by the court. Release arrangements are part of the administration of a sentence, and the overall penalty remains unchanged. And as I was outlining earlier, Mr Speaker, domestic and ECHR case law supports our stance that Article 7 is not engaged where the penalty imposed by the court is not altered. The measures in the bill will also amend the release arrangements for terrorist offenders sentenced in Scotland, which will ensure a consistent approach, where possible, to the release of terrorist prisoners. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Can I commend my right honourable friend for the introduction of this legislation and dealing with this issue of early release. But perhaps I can come back to him on a point that I've raised previously about how we do manage risk of people who have offended once they have left prison. The availability of post-release conditions, the enforceability of that, and indeed the TPIMS regime and its potential application to give that sense of assurance. Could he comment any further on the next steps, how he looks at how this can be progressed? Because clearly this is an issue that will need to be addressed.
Well, I'm hugely grateful, Mr Speaker, to my right honourable friend, who the House will know was a distinguished security Minister and Northern Ireland Secretary, having to deal with these issues daily. I'll say this to him. He will know that the counter-terrorism bill that was announced some weeks ago will be coming before this House soon. There will be measures in there relating not only to the minimum term to be served for serious terror offences, but also the way in which licence periods will be applied as part of that sentence. That's clearly, I think, one of the most effective ways to deal with this problem through the criminal conviction, the prosecution and conviction process. However, he makes that wider point. One that he will know from his time having navigated the TPIM legislation through this House, subsequently strengthened and amended, that there are other circumstances in which public protection will have to play a function absent a conviction. And it is that particular area, that particular cohort, that the government is placing a lot of attention and concentration upon. I think it would be perhaps idle of me to try and speculate and outline what precise forms those would take, but it is a dialogue that I would encourage him to take part in actively over the next few months, and it's something that I would want to develop with support from all parts of this House. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
At this stage in the debate, and trying to avoid our having what might otherwise turn into a kind of argument about the law in court, could I just ask him whether the case of Del Rio Prado has actually been taken into account? Does he know that that has been taken into account in this case, because it was about policy and administration?
No, he will be glad to know not only is it being taken into account, but I've read it. It's a 2013 authority from the Strasbourg court. It relates to a particular set of circumstances involving the Kingdom of Spain. There have been subsequent cases, both before that court and indeed domestically. In summary, Mr. Speaker, we are satisfied on the basis of all the information we have that the provisions of Article 7 are not engaged in this respect. And I'll give way to my
right honourable learned friends make a most compelling case for this legislation, and for the sake of completeness, I'm sure he will also have read and taken into account the subsequent cases in the Strasbourg Court of Maiden in the United Kingdom in 2016 and of the Supreme Court in Doherty in 2017, both subsequent to Rio del Prado, which it seems to me support the government's contention.
Well, I'd say to my honourable friend, as I'm sure he's heard many times in court, his submissions find great force with the government, and we are persuaded by them. I was going on to deal with the issue about parole release and in the ambit of that release. Oh, and I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Very grateful to the Lord Chancellor, and I appreciate, just before he moves on to another point, I think it's very clear that he is carrying the House with him this afternoon, and that all of us are seized by the necessity to bring forward this bill at this time and as quickly as possible. But it is acknowledged that there are serious concerns and issues around the engagement of Article 7. I think he has an entirely justifiable position, but also that we are bereft of the detailed pre-legislative scrutiny that we otherwise might, and that's a consequence of the situation we find ourselves in. But given that, has the Lord Chancellor given any consideration to injecting a review mechanism within this Act?
Lord Chancellor. Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. And in fact, I think it's right to say, in the context of Northern Ireland, we have given such careful consideration to the engagement of Article 7 that we've not chosen to extend the legislation to Northern Ireland, because the way in which the sentence is calculated and put together by the Northern Ireland courts does actually cause potential issues with regard to engagement and therefore potential interference with the nature of the penalty itself. And I think actually that is very important in this context, that it is real evidence of the fact that the British government has thought very carefully about the engagement of Article 7, has not sought to take a blanket approach to all parts or to the various jurisdictions within the United Kingdom. I hear what he says about a review mechanism. He will be reassured to know, of course, that a counter-terror bill is coming forward which will cover all parts of the United Kingdom. There will be opportunity within that bill to debate and analyse further long-term proposals, and inevitably the status and provisions of this bill, hopefully an Act of Parliament, will will be part of that ongoing debate. So I'm confident that through the mechanisms of this House, we will be able to subject these provisions to post-legislative scrutiny in the way that he would expect. I was explaining the extension of parole, and I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful to my right honourable and learned friend for giving way before he moves on to the parole board. He's mentioned already the effect of this legislation that will keep terrorist prisoners in custody for longer. And he's also paid, rightly, tribute to prison imams who maintain religious interventions for those whose motivation is at least claimed to be religious for their terrorist offending. Can he reassure us that given the extra time in custody that many of these prisoners will now serve, these sorts of effective and in many cases very brave interventions by prison imams will be given the extra time available to take further effect?
My right honourable learned friend, the former Attorney General, speaks with great experience and knowledge of these matters. He's absolutely right to focus upon the specialist intervention of our imams. I think I referred to the fact that we were going to increase resources and increase the number available within our prisons. Both the Home Secretary and I have seen at first hand the partnership working that goes on within the high security estate when it comes to dealing with these particular challenges, and it's precisely that type of specialist intervention that he and others can be confident about that we will be supporting in the years ahead. I was explaining the extension of parole release, Madam Deputy Speaker, who I welcome, to those who serve standard determinate sentences and other transitional cases currently subject to automatic release. And in line with the normal arrangements for prisoners released by the Parole Board, for this cohort of offenders, the Board will set the conditions of an offender's licence when they are released before the end of their sentence. The Parole Board, as I was outlining earlier, has the necessary powers and indeed the expertise to make risk-based release decisions for terrorist offenders. The Board currently deals with terrorists who serve indeterminate sentences, extended sentences, and those sentences for offenders of particular concern, the SPOCs as they are colloquially referred to. There is a cohort of specialist Parole Board members who are trained specifically to deal with terrorist and extremist offenders. They are, in effect, the specialised branch of the Board that will be used to handle these additional cases. They include retired High Court judges, retired police officers and other experts in the field, all who have extensive experience of dealing with the most sensitive and difficult terrorist cases. Due to the nature of the emergency legislation, I've proposed that the provisions cover both England, Wales and Scotland, and the justification for this emergency retrospective legislation, out of the ordinary though I accept it is to prevent the automatic release of terrorist offenders in the coming weeks and months. Given the risk that this cohort have shown already that they pose to the public, it's vital that we pass this legislation rapidly before any more terrorists are automatically released from custody at the halfway point. And therefore we're aiming for this legislation to receive royal assent before the end of the month. And with the support of this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am confident that we can do this, and I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill be now read a second term. Shadow Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I should say, first of all, that I'm grateful to the Justice Secretary for his briefing last week and for his opening remarks. And I'm also grateful to the Minister who's been keeping me updated in recent days. This piece of legislation follows the awful terrorist atrocities, first at Fishmongers Hall on the 30th of November, and more recently, of course, in Streatham. And I would like to say from the outset that my thoughts, and the thoughts I'm sure of all members across this House, go out to the victims of these terrible attacks, their families and friends, and we thank the emergency services who responded so quickly. We on these benches support the Parole Board involvement in release decisions, and should this legislation not be passed and rush through all its stages in the next couple of weeks, then there will be terrorist prisoners on our streets without any Parole Board assessment of risk or dangerousness. Now, that isn't to say that it leaves the House in the easiest of positions, but that is the reality of the position that is before us. I do say to ministers today that what is going to be needed for this to be durable and workable is that it doesn't amount to simply a delay confronting the problem, but there is a relentless focus on and investment in the most effective of de-radicalisation programmes in our prisons. I give way to
One of the most effective de-radicalisation programmes is that run by the Saudis, but it does take a long time. Is he satisfied that sentences are actually long enough to accommodate a successful programme?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I had a long debate on sentencing in the last Parliament with the then Security Minister, now the Defence Secretary, and a number of sentences were increased. But I thought that very fairly, actually, the former Prime Minister pointed out in her intervention on the Justice Secretary, there's certainly been an issue with the success of the programmes in recent years. Now, length of the sentence is one matter, but whatever the length of the sentence is, that programme must be targeted and effective, and that's something I will come to in a moment in my remarks. Because whilst we are here for emergency legislation, it is also an emergency in resources. Now, the Leader of the House indicated yesterday that the Treasury had approved additional resources for the additional time prisoners spend in custody as a consequence of this bill, and for the parole board, but clearly there's going to have to be, in addition to that, a specific and dramatic increase in resources to tackle extremism in our prisons. It isn't just about resources. I think my honourable friend, the member for Stretford and Urmston, made the point about process and expertise, and she's absolutely right about that as well. But that clearly will require a strategic approach from the very top. The Justice Secretary has made clear that there is no need for derogation from the European Convention on Human Rights, and he's set out the government legal position with regard to Article 7. We on these benches firmly believe that we can tackle the issue of terrorism and proudly remain signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights. To leave it and to join Belarus as the only non-European signatory would, in our view, be to send out a terrible signal to the rest of the world. And we should never sacrifice the values, the very values that we are defending in the fight against terrorism and hatred. Madam Deputy Speaker, those who perpetrate hatred and violence are responsible for their own actions. But it is for the government to do everything it can to keep our streets safe and to minimise the risk of something like this ever happening again. And I do think the House today is entitled to ask the question as to why we have ended up requiring this law to be made via emergency legislation. Automatic early release is hardly new. It's been part of our system for many years and could have already been dealt with by a government that took a more strategic approach. And over the past decade, there have been a number of warning signals. The Justice Secretary mentioned Ian Aitchison in his opening speech, former prison governor who led a review of Islamist extremism in our prisons, probation and indeed youth justice system, which was published in August of 2016. This is what Mr. Aitchison said, and I quote, "What we found was so shockingly bad that I had to agree to the language in the report being toned down. There were serious deficiencies in almost every respect of the management of terrorist offenders throughout the prison system, and it was a shambles." A shambles. Now, Mr. Aitchison proposed 69 recommendations that, according to the Justice Secretary on the media on the weekend, had been consolidated into a total of 11, 8 of which the Justice Secretary said was being implemented. But this is what Mr. Aitchison said in a newspaper article last Thursday. He said, "As part of my review of prison extremism, I made a great number of recommendations that specifically related to a tactical response to a terrorist incident in prison where staff were targeted. I have no way of knowing if or how many were implemented, as none made it into the response published by the Ministry of Justice." Now, that was only days ago. I don't know if the Justice Secretary has met Mr Aitchison since last Thursday. He says, I'm proud for him to intervene and answer.
I'm extremely grateful to him. He makes a very important point. I haven't met Mr Aitchison since last Thursday, but I have met him. In fact, I took part in a documentary he produced for Radio 4 a few weeks ago before the latest attack. The engagement that he's had has been valued. I'm not going to go into the precise circumstances by which the report was consolidated, because in essence there were some sensitive matters within the report that we all understood at the time could not be published. But I'll say this, that he's right to talk about 2016, and we accepted what Mr Aitchison said, but things have moved on a long way since then. And the problems that he identified are being directly tackled. Still more to be done, we accept, but we have moved on in the 4 years since that report, he'd be glad to know.
Well, I'll come to the issue of whether things have moved on in a moment, because we'll be exploring what the Chief Inspector of Prisons says about that. But as regards what Mr Aitchison said last Thursday, he clearly was unsure of the position only days ago. And I take what the Justice Secretary says, well, what's in the public domain. Of course, that's entirely appropriate. But one would hope that someone who led a review for the government would know 4 years later whether or not specific recommendations had been acted upon or not. And I take what the Justice Secretary says about appearing in a documentary, but I would strongly suggest he meets with Mr Aitchison fairly urgently and discusses, I will give way to him in a moment, and discusses with him precisely what Mr Aitchison isn't sure of, so that that matter can be cleared up. I'll give way.
For giving way. I should have added that indeed I have offered and he has accepted a full briefing from HMPPS as to the issues that we are talking about.
I am pleased to hear that, and I hope we'll never be in this situation again where someone all those years later, having led that review, isn't aware of what's going on. That simply cannot happen and shouldn't, I'm sure the Secretary of State would agree, be the case. Because there are concerns, frankly, about the Ministry of Justice listening and the extent to which justice has been a priority for the government over the past decade. The coalition government chose not to make the Ministry of Justice a protected department when it implemented spending cuts. And that's led to 40% cuts over the past decade, including to the very prisons that we're all here today are expected to play a vital role in offender management. We know 21,000 police officers disappeared from our streets, and prison officer numbers have been slashed as well. There's currently only 18,912 frontline prison officers, still not back at 2010 levels. And that loss of prison officers, Madam Deputy Speaker, didn't just reduce the capacity of prisons to deal with issues of rehabilitation, it also meant that years and years of experience in working in challenging environments in our prisons have been lost. In 2019, 35% of prison officers had been in post for less than 2 years. That's compared to just 7% back in 2010. I'm not saying that those officers, of course, aren't doing their best in very difficult circumstances, but it is to say that the government needlessly threw away very valuable experience in our prisons.
Would my honourable friend give way? Would he agree, due to the lack of prison officers that we've had, and by privatising some of those prisons and having young officers in there, has led to certainly problems in HMP Birmingham, where there's been a number of riots over the last couple of years, and that actually adds more to the cost of the Treasury, rather than putting real people in, and people with experience have been taken away, and bring them back in.
My honourable friend speaks with great authority about HMP Birmingham and his own knowledge from his constituency. But he's also quite right to identify that if you run prisons in that way, then it is going to have particular consequences. And of course, it reduces the time available for meaningful activity. Now, on the media on the weekend, the Justice Secretary talked about improvements in our justice system since Mr Aitchison's report. He repeated it in his speech and just repeated it in an intervention a moment or two ago. So what I thought I'd do is compare what the Justice Secretary is saying with the views of the Independent Chief Inspector of Prisons. And the latest annual report from Peter Clark, the Chief Inspector, said this, and I quote, "Far too many of our jails have been plagued by drugs, violence, appalling living conditions, and a lack of access to meaningful rehabilitative activity. Now that should be a wake-up call to the government. Mr Clark went on to say, and I quote, "Levels of self-harm were disturbingly high and self-inflicted deaths tragically increased by nearly 1/5 on the previous year." Madam Deputy Speaker, that is no way for a prison service to be run, and things must change. And there is as well, if I may say so, an issue at the Ministry of Justice with the government failing to provide it with stable leadership. The Right Honourable Gentleman is the 7th Justice Secretary since 2010. 7th. And of those 7, 5 have served for 18 months or less. The role of Lord Chancellor should have been respected and not been subject to a revolving door. No wonder there is a lack of direction, no wonder there isn't any long-term planning, as the Justice Secretaries simply aren't in post long enough. There are even indications from 10 Downing Street that half the Cabinet could be out by Friday, and I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman in all sincerity, I hope very much that he survives in this role. Because there is an enormous job. I hope I haven't jinxed him by saying that. I could have just ruined his Friday. But there is an enormous job to do, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are 224 terrorist prisoners in England and Wales, of whom 173 have been assessed as having extreme Islamist views, and we also know there is a growing threat from far-right terrorism. If we want to properly manage the risk of terrorist offenders, we need the most effective, targeted de-radicalisation programmes being delivered by staff in the best conditions we can provide for them.
Will he give way?
I'll give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and I almost intervened on the Lord Chancellor because the one area that hasn't been mentioned in this, when I just completed the police parliamentary scheme and spent some time with the counter-terrorism units, the one area that they highlighted was mental health resources in our communities to work with on the ground. And that risk decision, that decision about someone's mental capacity and their radicalisation, at that community level is really important when we look at resources, and the cuts to our mental health services are also impacting on this area.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think one of the issues sometimes is we tend to see things in isolation and not the fact that cuts to many other services have also had an impact. It's something the government needs to take into account. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, when we talk about conditions for our prison officers to work in, we still have 1/3 of our prisons built in the Victorian era. There's a £900 million maintenance backlog, and there's a desperate need for new investment. I'll give way to him.
In relation to the question of mental disturbance, does the Honourable Gentleman accept that there are circumstances in which, for example, the principle of mens rea may not apply simply because the person in question, for a variety of reasons, some of which may be drug affected, some of which may be intrinsic, actually is incapable of making an act within the framework of mens rea, and that in those circumstances we should perhaps be thinking further down the line as to what kind of containment people need in order to be restrained from performing these murderous acts.
Well, there are a number of issues, I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, of course, about mens rea, which is an essential element of committing a criminal offence. There are various issues that have been decided before the courts in relation to that. But in relation to those who do suffer from severe mental health problems, there are also already elements of our law that can deal with those situations, and they can be used and operated appropriately on a multi-agency basis. I'll give way.
Take this opportunity to reiterate my previous intervention. The suspicion is that there are people who are gravely mentally ill who are in prison when they actually ought to be treated as if they are criminally insane and held in secure psychiatric units. And the concern is that people are being treated as terrorists when they're clearly mad, simply because they have picked up some smattering of something that passes for a religious motivation.
Well, where I can agree to a degree is I certainly accept that there are people with mental health problems in prison who shouldn't be, frankly. But if we come to the issue of psychiatric units, which I think is what the Honourable Gentleman is referring to, secure psychiatric units, there's also a shortage of places there as well, which is another issue that the government needs to accept on the basis of the past 10 years. And we are asking, ultimately, I heard what the Justice Secretary said about specialist officers, particularly in de-radicalisation programmes, but we are also tolerating a situation, frankly, where physical attacks on our prison staff have risen. And to be fair, and that can't be fair to them, in order to have a constructive environment in our prisons. From September 2018 to 2019, there were 33,222 assaults, 23,592 prisoner-on-prisoner, and 10,059 assaults on staff, alongside, by the way, the highest ever recorded levels of self-harm. Now, today, the Justice Secretary, I'm sure, would argue will deal with the immediate crisis of the next few weeks, but he must plan ahead. And I say this too, the crisis in our criminal justice system doesn't end with our prisons. We also need the best possible probation services and the best possible supervision. In 2014, the government part privatised the probation service. I don't think it's unfair to say it was an absolute disaster. The government had more than 150,000 people supervised by private community rehabilitation companies and just left the high-risk offenders managed by the National Probation Service. The Chief Inspector of Probation, Dame Glenys Stacey, said last year, and I quote, "The system which sees private firms monitor criminals serving community sentences is irredeemably flawed," and she's right. No wonder the Right Honourable Gentleman's predecessor had to announce that the supervision of all offenders on probation in England and Wales was being put back into the public sector last year. I'll give way.
The Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He's making a play about capacity, and that seems to be reasonable. But early release, of course, and there have been scores of people released early since 2013. I'm speaking of terrorist convicts. Adds to the demand on capacity, which he's making a case that we should address. So, on that basis, I'm sure he wants to support the Secretary of State in taking that pressure away, building the morale, and allowing the police to exercise capacity in a more effective way, as he described.
Well, yes, and I've made clear about my support for the measures before us today. I've made that absolutely clear, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what my point is simply this. Today we'll deal with an immediate crisis. What it won't do is deal with the broader, deeper problems that we have that will need to be dealt with in the months and years ahead. And to use the point about probation, Madam Deputy Speaker, and its botched part privatisation, the National Audit Office announced that part privatisation had cost the taxpayer nearly £500 million. Quite frankly, it is time for good sense and consistency in policy making at the Ministry of Justice. And with regard to the Home Office, the independent review of the Prevent programme, which I secured in the last Parliament, I think I've debated it previously with the Right Honourable Gentleman across the floor, has been announced, but there is no reviewer. We are now a year from the point at which the bill that he and I debated received royal assent. Lord Carlisle was appointed to it, but resigned before Christmas because he'd already expressed views on the programme. And the government have hardly shown any urgency in appointing a replacement. It's high time that they did. And whilst I appreciate that isn't the responsibility of the Justice Secretary, I'm sure he will pass that message on to Cabinet colleagues that that reviewer needs to be appointed and the review must take place and make recommendations. Madam Deputy Speaker, today really must be a day when that focus on rehabilitation comes and we do actually turn the page away from the decade of problems that we've seen in our criminal justice system. Now, one of the recommendations made by Mr. Aitchison was for an independent advisor on counter-terrorism in prisons. I would go further and press the Justice Secretary on actually providing external scrutiny and assessment of the de-radicalisation programmes across our prison estate. And that way, this House can regularly assess the position, and we will not be in a situation where we are again taken by surprise or are responding on the hoof. We cannot tolerate a position when our prisons become breeding grounds for extremism, and we need to be asking searching questions. Madam Deputy Speaker, this emergency legislation will, I hope, now pass without a division. And alongside it, I hope the Government will now invest in the very best expertise available in counter-extremism and tackle the crisis in our prisons. It is only by doing that that the Government can truly say it's doing all it can to keep our streets safe. And in doing that, we will be holding them to account.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must say that both the front bench speeches have been very thoughtful, and I think that measures and matches the importance and significance of this debate. Can I say that I think my Right Honourable and learned friend, the Lord Chancellor, made a very compelling case for this legislation. It's not the type of legislation that the House should undertake upon lightly, but ultimately the protection of the public is something which must trump all other considerations. Now, it is always right that we should protect the public in a way which is commensurate with the rule of law. And I believe that the Government and the Lord Chancellor have managed to achieve that balance. And I'm glad that the official opposition recognised that too. That's a fundamental duty for all of us, and reconciling the two is a considerable achievement under the pressures of this time. The reason I think it's necessary to move in this way, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been well set out. But as somebody who has represented a London constituency, many of whose constituents work in and around the very places where we've seen so many atrocities, it brings home to us profoundly the catastrophic risk that can come when an individual is released, even though the index offence which caused them to go to prison may not have led to a very long sentence. Nonetheless, the nature, I'm sorry to say, of the type of terrorism that we see now, often based upon perverted ideologies and the deep-seatedness of the hatreds which that breeds, do give us the need to be particularly careful and cautious about all forms of release going forward. And the fact that once the automatic period of release has been moved to 2/3, it will in fact no longer be automatic, will be in all cases after the consideration of the parole board, is itself also a worthwhile and important aspect of the bill. Of course I give way to my honourable friend.
And I listen as ever with great interest to everything that my honourable friend says. Does he think, however, that this question of this bill has a limited effect, whereas really the problems which we are facing have a much longer-term consequence? And does he also believe, therefore, that we ought to be having a more rigorous analysis, this being only emergency legislation, into the future to make sure that human life in this country takes priority over the interpretation of law?
Well, I certainly agree that we need a more detailed analysis as to the best approach to what is a threat which continues to change and develop. And I think my right honourable friend is right on that matter. And I think it's right that this is of itself a discrete and emergency measure to deal with a specific and urgent problem. I certainly think we need to look at the way in which we deal with sentencing and the treatment of these particular individuals and the protection of the public in that context. That is absolutely right. I happen to believe, lest it be hinted at, that that's perfectly capable of being achieved within our continuing adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights, and I think a series of British court decisions would tend to support that. But the broader thrust that there's more work to do in this field, my honourable friend is absolutely right about. I think the government, I got the sense that the government and the Lord Chancellor recognise that too. Coming to this specific legislation, it's right that we should consider the necessity of it. I would have thought that was well made out now. That's one of the principles of the rule of law. Lord Bingham famously set out a number of principles. One shouldn't act in haste unless there is compelling reason, but the very reality of blood being shed on the streets of this country itself, it seems to me, is a compelling reason. And the fact that people have been released and then very so swiftly and very frequently seized articles and used them to catastrophic effect, it seems to me to make this legislation both necessary and indeed proportionate as well. So I hope that the House will have no hesitation in supporting it. The one issue that seems, particularly amongst legal circles, to have raised some concern is whether or not there is any risk of retrospectivity. I don't seek to see retrospective legislation. I don't believe, for the reasons that the Lord Chancellor set out, that is the case. When I was in practice at the bar, it was very clear that the prospect of early release, whether or not that might occur, was not a consideration that any judge should take into account in passing sentence. The principle was, and always has been, that the sentence should be passed commensurate with the level of the gravity, seriousness of the offence, any other legitimate mitigating or aggravating circumstances which the Crown or the defence can put forward. The prospect that there may or may not be of release thereafter was never regarded as a consideration affecting the penalty, and that's important to the argument that this is retrospectively increasing the penalty, which I think is a misguided argument to make under these circumstances. It was often said that the prospect of early release, in effect, ameliorates the penalty that was passed rather than anything else. And there's a string of authority, as has been said, in both the UK and the Strasbourg Court, to the effect that the penalty, I'll just make this point and then give way to my right honourable friend, that the penalty passed is that which is the total duration of the penalty which is laid down by the court at the time. That's the bit that can't be changed retrospectively, and the legislation does not seek to do that. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Well, my right friend, from his long experience of these things, is making a cogent argument, of course, about the character of penalties. And, of course, you might want to go further. The problem with the assumption about automatic early release is injurious to the very principle that he set out. Early release has always been part of judicial considerations, but on the basis of an assessment of risk and merit and worthiness. And automatic early release runs against those principles.
Well, I understand that point, and it's something which is certainly something I think in more broad terms we can debate when the larger piece of sentencing legislation comes forward, as I understand it, later in this session. Yes. For the purposes of this legislation, of course, effectively that's what you're doing, that as well as moving the two-thirds, the point from half to two-thirds of release, you're then automatically saying there must be consideration with the parole board. And the one thing I make on that is it's very important that the parole board have the resource and the expertise to carry out the additional and heavy burden that they must properly take on board for this. There have been good reforms to the parole board since, for example, the War Boys case, and the Justice Select Committee in the last Parliament looked at and urged changes to the way in which parole operated, which I know have been acted upon. So I think there is movement in the right direction, but we must be ever vigilant in making sure that they have the resource, and that may include more specialist resource in those terms. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very interested in my honourable friend's lucid speech, and in particular the fact that he says that the sentence imposed by judges is meant to reflect the gravity of the crime, does explain why so many people feel shortchanged. Victims feel shortchanged when people are let out early. And when we do come to consider the larger question of sentencing, wouldn't it make more sense to have judges impose sentences that people will actually serve and extend them if people misbehave in jail, rather than reducing them if they behave?
It's an interesting point that's made, and we will want to, I think, look at a number of issues when we debate the sentencing bill. I would just say, by way of caution, when you start extending the sentence and the penalty, then you do, I think, run the risk of falling foul of the principle against retrospectivity. And that isn't, with respect to my right honourable friend, something that I would wish to see. That's different from remission of the sentence for earned good behaviour, which was the traditional system that we grew up with. But it's an important distinction with respect that has to be drawn. I'll give one more time.
Give it away one more time. But no, I mean, the point about extending the sentence would be they'd be extending it because of the commission of a further offence whilst in prison, and that would not be retrospectivity.
Well, that's, with respect to our honourable friend, it's an interesting point. It's a wholly different consideration. And there has been much debate, and again, the Select Committee has looked at this and has urged that when there is an offence, for example, an assault on a prison officer, there is a compelling case very often, as a matter of public policy, for that to be charged as an additional offence, rather than being dealt with under the prison disciplinary rules, as is frequently the case at the moment. I'd be with him as far as that goes, and perhaps as far as we need take it for the purposes of today's debate. But the other thing I just wanted to deal with on retrospectivity is this. I know that some learned commentators have raised concerns on the basis of the European Court decision of Del Rio Prada, which, when you look at it, itself, I think, at most raises a tangential concern or a speculative concern that there might be retrospectivity. I think the briefing I saw from the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, which I've got a lot of respect for, and therefore I think it's right to address it, says that arguably this could be regarded as falling foul of one of the principles. It doesn't come down hard and fast in that regard, but it's worth bearing in mind that was a decision after a very particularly convoluted history of changes within the Spanish judicial system, utterly different from what we're seeing here. And subsequently, there have been decisions both in the Strasbourg court in the reference, the application of a Maiden against the United Kingdom, and subsequently the decision by the Supreme Court here in the UK in the case of Doherty, where the line of reasoning, it seems to me much more consistent with the traditional stance that we've had ever since the House of Lords decision in the case of Utland, that the changes to remission and early release provisions are part of the administration or execution of the sentence and not part of the penalty. And that seems such a well-established principle that we ought, I think, to have confidence that we can act upon that in this case. I'll give way to the Minister, of course.
Well, I just wanted to say I wholeheartedly concur with the honourable and learned gentleman's analysis, but just to add, in the Rio del Prada case, which he refers to, that touched on the way that concurrent sentences were calculated, really a wholly different matter to the one before the House today.
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and in legal parlance, if I was being asked to distinguish the two, I would have thought that was the most material consideration for distinguishing between those cases and the current ones that we are dealing with here. So I hope that the House will be reassured, having considered and thought about, will be reassured on the retrospectivity point. The final things I'd say very briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, are these. It is important, though, as other honourable members have observed, to recognise that this is a specific piece of legislation to deal with a specific and discrete problem. It does not mean that we should not act urgently to deal with the broader issue of how do we deal with this particular type of terrorism which has developed in recent years. How do we contain those who are deeply radicalised within prison? How do we prevent further radicalisation within prison? And there's some concern that, for example, the Streatham attacker was continuing, it seems, potentially to have received radicalisation material whilst in prison. I think we need to look most urgently at that. And, of course, the real threat that many of us have come across of hardline terrorist prisoners seeking to further radicalise more vulnerable inmates within the prison estate. And that's a real risk, and that's an issue which Mr Aitchison, who has been referred to favourably, I think, by many in the course of this debate, addressed. I'm glad to hear that the Lord Chancellor has been in touch with Mr Aitchison. I share the view of the Shadow Minister that I think Mr Aitchison has a good deal more to give to this discussion. Things have moved on since his 2016 report. He was certainly a most compelling witness when he appeared before the Justice Select Committee in the then Parliament, and it may be that we'd like to have the benefit of his views again. But it's certainly something I hope the government will make the point of engaging directly with him as to see how, within the new context, we can continue to take on that expertise and other expertise. I think it's also right that we look to build upon the good work which is being done within the chaplaincy service in the form of the specialist imams. We haven't perhaps looked often enough and given enough credit to the work of prison chaplaincy generally and of the specialist imams, who have a very difficult task to fulfil, and from those I've met, often do so very admirably. But what can we do more to give them greater professional, pastoral, if you like, and practical and professional support in carrying out that task? I think that's an important area. I hope the Minister will confirm that we intend to continue with work on that area. And what can we do to make sure that those prisoners who are held in, for example, Belmarsh near me, in South East London, significant numbers of terrorist prisoners held in a high security prison. Can we make sure that they're being done so in a way which A, does not pose any further threat to staff in terms of attacks, an issue that Mr Aitchison dealt with, and also, as I say, any threat either physically or in terms of further corruption to other more vulnerable inmates with whom they might be serving. So this is an important piece of legislation. I hope the House will speed it through, but there is much more work to do. And I'll end up, although the Lord Chancellor is not now with us, concurring with the Shadow Minister in one final point. I too have been frustrated as Chairman of the Select Committee at the revolving door of Secretaries of State and Ministers who have appeared before us over the years. I very much hope that the Lord Chancellor will stay in office for very many years and very successfully. And I would have thought the way he's handled this delicate matter, as he did yesterday, gives him as good a claim to that as any. And I hope that hasn't done too much damage from my side of the House either. Thank you.
Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all concur with the Lord Chancellor's comments that one of the primary duties of any government in any country is to keep its population safe. I would go as far as to say that that applies to everybody who is elected to this institution, indeed to any democratic chamber. Nobody seeks to make their constituency, let alone their country, unsafe. And therefore, it's in that spirit that we come to this debate. We do understand the spirit of the legislation, and we do also understand the need for urgency, because I've had to deal with urgent and special procedures on severe matters in danger to the public in another chamber. There are, though, obviously some duties, and we do also have some element of proportionality. I think the Lord Chancellor used the word cohorts. I do think it is important that we put on record, despite what might be put across by some tabloid newspapers or by others, we're not dealing with thousands, we're not dealing with hundreds, we're dealing, he said, I think 50, some actually suggested it might even be lower than that. Equally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we do recognise that they may be few in number, but the danger and damage that they can cause in our communities is significant, as we've sadly seen. By all means.
In concurring with what he's just said, he will, however, recognise that even to keep close surveillance of one of those people can involve up to 50 members of Special Branch or MI5, and therefore only a handful of them will severely test the resources of the security services.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to come to that particular point, given my own involvement as a former Justice Secretary in Scotland. But we do have, as I say, on these opposition benches a duty not only to ensure public safety, but also to challenge and hold the government to account on proportionality, on practicality, and indeed on operability. So some issues we'll test, some issues we'll probe, to ensure that public safety criteria that we all, on whatever side of this House, share, are being met. But I can give the Minister the assurance that we're not dealing or opposing the general principles of the bill. That deals me to the first question of retrospectivity that's been commented by many members. It is unusual, it is rare, it's infrequently done. We are open to it, but we do have some caveats. And in doing so, I think the major caveat is that we have to ensure that we get it right, because we do appreciate and indeed very much welcome the extensive consideration that's been given and indeed provided to all members of the logic and thinking. But it is important, because I'm always conscious of the analogy of wasps in the jar. If you shake them all about and then you let them out, then you're going to get stung. And I think what we have to ensure is that if we are dealing with retrospectivity, and as I say, we're sympathetic to that, but we do take on board the points made by the Bingham Centre that members will have seen earlier today. So we're seeking as much assurance as can be given by the Minister, because no absolute assurance, we recognise, can be given, but that he is as certain as he can be that we won't face protracted litigation, a rewrite or further emergency legislation, and indeed the potential calamitous problems that may follow upon that, with the reference to the analogy of wasps in a jar. But that takes us on to the substantive issues that have been dealt with by many in the Chamber of both sides, but in particular by the member for Turfane. Because the real issue, I think, at the end of the day here is radicalisation. And our primary concern in these benches is not so much with the nature of the legislation, but the action with prisoners, current or future, that has been and must most certainly be taken in the future. Because it's one thing to detain them longer, it's quite another to do something constructive with them when you have them. And that is the nub of the problem, and that is the underlying issue that we're seeking to test with the government. Because I think it was the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, who mentioned that all will ultimately be released. And indeed, I had significant discussions with her when I was Justice Secretary and she was Home Secretary. The likelihood is that most will be released, bar for a very small few, perhaps even only a handful. We have to ensure that when that date comes, that we are as safe as we can be. And indeed, although no government can give every assurance that nobody will reoffend, we have to be as sure as we can be that the risk is limited, or indeed that the actions to protect the public are in fact in place. So that, as I say, reminds me once again why we're generally supportive of the thrust of the amendments coming from the opposition benches and indeed mentioned by the member for Turfane. The real issue isn't the legislation, but the action to de-radicalise when within our prisons and monitor when without them. Equally, we recognise that it is a relatively new phenomenon, and I think many members have mentioned that it's been with us for more years than we care to remember. But it is a challenge for those involved in criminal justice because it's a new aspect. We do have to think out the box, which is why the mention of the input of imams is extremely important. They are to be welcomed and sometimes face significant challenges, if not threats themselves. Because, as I say, we do have to address them within and monitor them without. Dealing with, by all means.
The point he's making is absolutely correct, but there will be some who will not be de-radicalised. In that circumstance, and when it does come for their release, they're not mentally ill, they have a different view of the world. Is it not the case that we may need to look at reviewing perhaps the treason law, as my honourable friend, the member for Tonbridge and Malling, suggested at the weekend?
No, I don't think that that would be required. I think there are ways in which we can deal with them. I think the chair of the committee will know better than I, and the law in Scotland is somewhat different in how we address psychopathy. There's always difficulties in dealing with mental health. It challenges the courts as it challenges those in the health service who quite correctly deal with them. I do think it comes to an issue of dealing with a new phenomenon. There are those who are mentally ill and who either individually or indeed encouraged by others are set loose to cause havoc, and they have to be tried to be dealt with by the National Health Services as best we can. There are others who are simply malevolent. We do indeed currently have powers under terrorist legislation, so I don't think that there's any additional matter there. It comes on to the point of how we deal with them within and how we deal with them without. And dealing with the latter first, obviously monitoring them, as the member across the chamber mentioned earlier, is extremely resource significant. It's not a matter of somebody in a rain jacket tailing an individual or even accompanied by another. It takes dozens and indeed often significantly more, because there's back office, there's different shifts, there's different ways of monitoring in the world in which we live. The resource just to deal with one individual, never mind the supply chain that we know accompanies them, is significant, and that is why there has to be assurances that that will be provided, because more police numbers are required, certainly south of the border, but the input of terrorism impact upon policing is significant, and that has to be taken on board, given the other demands that they rightly face within our communities. That deals to the former issue, and it deals to the point, I think, leads on to the point being made about the HS2 review as far back as 2016, where it does appear that little has to be done. It does appear to me from discussions that one of the points made by Mr Aitchison, and quite correctly, I think welcomed by the government, was that there should be specialist separation units within prisons. Now, I understand some 4 were established, but only 1, I think, at HMP Frankland is in operation. I may be open to correction or challenge on that, but if that is the situation, then frankly it is simply not good enough. If you have an independent reviewer of the stature of Mr Aitchison, we all agree, then you're duty-bound to implement it. If he brings in specific points that you go to the trouble of actually establishing, then it is rather mind-blowing that only 1 should be operating. So I would hope and expect that the Minister, by all means.
I find that I needed to interject because I agreed with you on a point of special separation units. I think that we do need to look at how we can increase our numbers, because what we're seeing is people coming in who are already radicalized and then preying on vulnerable inmates to increase the levels of radicalization. And the suggestion has been made, can we put people who are already convicted of these terrorist crimes in a separate unit to not increase the spread of radicalization? And I think my friend makes a very good point.
Thank you for that. I think it's something that we've addressed in this country in previous years with other prisoners. I do recollect even within my tenure we did have special units for those involved in paramilitary units from Northern Ireland. But it is something that's come in, it's something that's deeply specialist, but it will require both those involved in this establishment, but also to the prison service, which deals me on to another aspect, which is de-radicalisation programmes. It is difficult, I recognise, in terms of how we check against delivery, or indeed how we ensure that actually they're working or operating, but I do think we need to take steps. But there's one particular point that I would make a special request to the Minister to take on board, which is that there should be the input of prison officers within these courses. At the present moment, my understanding that their input is very limited, indeed almost nil. They're outsourced and brought in, and that's understandable. People have specialist resources that were mentioned at NIMANS. But let's also recommend and understand that prison officers have remarkable skills. They are able to see who is pulling the wool over their eyes. They might not be trained in this or qualified in that, but they know psychology and individuals within the prison institution. They can tell you who's going through, in the main, because nobody can fundamentally always get it right. But these officers have huge skills in being able to say who's actually signing up because they just want to be able to tick the box and be able to satisfy the parole board, as it will be, or whether they're signing up and actually going through it because they believe in it, because they don't just engage with them on that course. They live with them 24/7. They can see who they're interacting with, what their behaviour is. So, as I say, I think that is something where we have been remiss, and I would ask the Minister to take that on board. So finally, I will draw my remarks to a conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, and simply say we are satisfied with the need for this. We're satisfied with the general principles. We do wish assured that retrospectivity will be addressed, and we do want satisfaction that there will be the resources both within and without provided. If that is done, then no government we accept can give us an absolute categorical assurance that these people will not reoffend, but can at least go back to our constituencies and say to our constituents and our people there that we're doing as much as we can to keep our communities safe.
It's a pleasure to call Dr. Kieran Mullen to make his maiden speech.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for this opportunity to make my maiden speech. I'm conscious of the seriousness of this topic as I embark on the traditional features of a maiden speech to start with, but we know the positive community stories I will share are exactly what the terrorists seek to destroy and that this bill seeks to stop them from doing. I want to begin by paying tribute to my predecessor, Laura Smith. Laura was vociferous in her advocacy and, like me, has frontline experience of public services. Before becoming a politician, Laura was a primary school teacher and a private tutor. It's a good thing to have diverse backgrounds and experiences in this place. Crewe and Nantwich is a true melting pot of northern Britain, and I couldn't possibly do all its diversity justice in this short speech. I represent a large number of villages and parishes, including Haslington, Williston, Worcesterston, Rope, Huff, Basford, Shavington, Bartomley, Weston, Leighton and Wimbury.
Just a few.
Across the constituency you can see a whole host of community activities that embed each of these places in my mind. Huff Village will always be best known to me as the home of a monthly charity bingo club set up by village resident Celia Brown. Raising thousands of pounds for charity over the years, I pay tribute to the amazing contribution Celia and her family have made to charity fundraising. Williston hosts the annual World Worm Charming Championships, which sees competitors travel from as far afield as New Zealand and Australia. I will ensure that the upcoming reform of the immigration system makes the necessary visas available for those wishing to compete in this important global competition. We have a host of fantastic local sports teams, including Crewe and Nantwich Rugby Club, that I play for. There is no better way of keeping your feet firmly on the ground than running around on the rugby pitch on a Saturday with teammates and opposition who couldn't care less about me being an MP, as a bruise on my cheek testifies to. The second team that I play for have a two-part team motto, the first part of which is win or lose, and the second part contains unparliamentary language I can't repeat in this place. But inevitably, the constituency is best known for its two towns of Crewe and Nantwich. Nantwich is a true gem in the Cheshire tourism crown, attracting streams of visitors every year, whether it be to the regular farmers markets, the famous food festival, or just to enjoy a stroll around the cobbled pavements with a view of St Mary's Church and the beautiful floral displays by Nantwich in Bloom. It's home to Barony Park, championed by friends of Barony Park and their irrepressible cheerleader Rachel Wright. Crewe is a town with a proud history, and there can be no better example of the kinds of towns this government is pledged to support. Everywhere you look, there are people fighting to make a difference. People like David MacDonald and Margaret Smith working hard to improve Crewe as part of Crewe Clean Team. And when the Beechmere residential home burnt down last year, the whole community rallied round. But it faces a declining high street and an ongoing struggle to return once again to the high point of its enormous contribution to our national economy as home to Crewe Works, which at one point employed 20,000 people designing and building world-famous trains. The site's famous 11-metre tall wall, standing for more than a century, was finally knocked down last year to make way for development. I grudgingly understand why this might have been the right decision, but it serves as a symbol of what we must get right for all of Crewe. Yes, let's see progress, as we soon will with the arrival of HS2 and with the town's fund investment. But we must ensure the reward is worth the cost, and losing the wall and the legacy it represents has been a blow for many local residents. Bombardier have allowed me to have a brick from that wall. That brick has pride of place in my office to serve as a constant reminder to me of what has passed and what must come next. Why do things like this wall matter to people? They matter because they help us tell a story of our lives and our history. 7 years ago, as a junior doctor, I had the privilege to look after Jan Krasnodebski, a Polish man of quiet dignity, admitted to hospital towards the end of his life. His family were deported from Poland to Russia during the war, and were then allowed by Stalin to join the British Army training camps in Persia. Jan eventually joined the Polish Army Cadet School in Palestine, and when the British mandate ended, came to Britain. He went on to live a rich life, but he had no wife or children. We would sometimes talk in the evenings, and he told me of his worry that without children of his own, his life would not be as vividly remembered as it deserved to be. As a gay man, the question of whether I will have children, how I would be remembered, sometimes crossed my mind at the time, so I felt an affinity towards him. We agreed that I would write the story of his life, so he could share it with others and ensure it would be remembered, and for a week, after I finished work, I sat with him as he quietly but studiously sketched it out for me. It was the story of two generations, both his and his parents, who lived in a world more precarious than most of us can imagine, and full of hardship but also dignity. What we wrote together was read at his funeral following his death a couple of months after he left hospital. In preparing this speech, I revisited this story, and in it, I think we can find some clues as to why, despite the hardship they faced, the upheaval, families like Jan's and the communities they lived in still lived content lives. As I share Jan's words now, they enter Hansard, so he can be sure his story is preserved forever. Jan told me, you can have a happy, fulfilled life as long as you do something that you think is important. When we get home from this place in the evenings, we climb into bed and all the pomp and the ceremony and the expectations on us fall away, and we're no different to Jan in his hospital bed, wanting to reflect on his life and feel it had meaning. And our constituents are no different either. Listening to the maiden speeches of many new members, I've been struck by how many have spoken about what we know is increasingly missing from people's lives. It's that sense of how they fit in with this ever-changing, complicated world we live in. People want meaning and a sense of where they belong. We forget too often that that comes in the form of expectations and obligations on us. Delivering on what we must give to others and what is expected of us helps to create our own sense of worth. There are no simple solutions to this challenge of people struggling with their identity and place in the world. If you have a low-paid, skilled job, but every week you help run a women's refuge, you can feel important. On the other hand, you can have a high-paid, high-skilled job, but get lost in the world of addiction because what you earn on its own has given you no sense of meaning. You can live on a deprived housing estate surrounded by drug-dealing gangs, but feel no temptation to join them because your loving family is all the community that you need. And you can hold enormous talent in your hands, but not feel valued because society has decided that grafting all day for a great wage is not as important or worthy as going to university. Today we are talking about the evils of terrorism, but at the heart of any successful terrorist recruitment campaign are people who have lost that sense of meaning in their own lives, leaving them vulnerable to simple narratives of victimhood and betrayal. We can build infrastructure, we can create jobs, but all of this sits in a vacuum if it isn't part of a broader story of a nation and a community that people feel part of. Of course, I will always believe that it is our families, the very first community we are part of, that can ensure we grow to become part of the wider world with confidence, ambition and a sense of right and wrong. People lacking that foundation need our help most of all.